The late afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, spilling golden light across the sleepy suburban stretch of Maple Street. Long shadows stretched over the neatly trimmed lawns and quiet sidewalks, painting the neighborhood in hues of amber and dusk. It was the sort of place where time seemed to linger, where the hum of daily life carried a gentle, unhurried rhythm. Mayo Clinic. A woman whose years had etched quiet strength into her features, moved steadily down the familiar path, her steps deliberate yet soft against the pavement. Her evening walk was a ritual she cherished, a moment to breathe in the crisp, cool air and let the stillness of the streets wrap around her like a comforting shawl. The world felt peaceful here. Or at least it usually did. But as she neared the corner where the small convenience store sat, a modest brick building with flickering neon signs and a faded awning, something shifted in the air. A ripple of unease tugged at her senses, pulling her gaze toward the entrance. There, beneath the lengthening shadows, a scene unfolded that made her chest tighten. A young black teenager, no older than 17 or 18, stood pressed against the rough brick wall, his hands lifted high, palms splayed outward in a gesture that screamed surrender. His frame was slight, swallowed up by a baggy hoodie, and his dark eyes darted nervously, wide with a fear that seemed to tremble through his entire body. Looming over him was a broad-shouldered figure clad in the stark navy of a police uniform, his presence dominating the space like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. Officer Ryan. She realized with a jolt of recognition. She'd seen him before, his stern face, his clipped strides, the way he carried himself with a tension that never seemed to ease. He wasn't the type for idle chit-chat or warm smiles, there was a hardness to him, a rigidity that always left Mayo faintly unsettled. And now, here he was. His voice slicing through the quiet with sharp, accusing tones, each word a hammer striking against the boy's fragile composure. Mayo's steps faltered, her sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk as she paused at the corner. She clutched the straps of her worn tote bag, her fingers tightening instinctively as she took in the scene. The boy, what was his name? Jamal, maybe, didn't look like a threat. His posture was all angles of panic and confusion. His shoulders hunched as if he could shrink away from the towering figure before him. Ryan's hand hovered near his holster, a silent menace that hung heavy in the air. And though Mayo couldn't make out the exact words spilling from his mouth, the aggression in his stance was unmistakable. She felt a familiar knot twist in her stomach. A churn of dread she'd known too many times in her long life. This wasn't right. She could see it in the boy's trembling hands, in the way his chest rose and fell with shallow, panicked breaths. He wasn't fighting back, wasn't resisting, just standing there, caught in a moment he didn't seem to understand. A handful of onlookers had gathered, their faces etched with unease. An older man with graying hair and a faded apron, the shop owner, she guessed, lingered behind the glass door, his brow creased with worry as he peered out at the confrontation. A woman pushing a stroller hesitated across the street, her lips parted as if she might speak, but her feet stayed rooted to the spot. Another man, clutching a paper bag of groceries, shifted his weight nervously, his eyes flicking between the officer and the boy. The tension was palpable, a thick fog settling over the scene, yet no one moved to intervene. Fear, Mayo thought bitterly, had a way of paralyzing even the best of intentions. She could feel it too, her own pulse quickening. Her knees trembling faintly beneath the hem of her long skirt, but something deeper stirred within her, something stronger than the instinct to turn away. She'd spent her life teaching children to stand up to bullies, to do what was right even when it was hard. It was a lesson carved into her bones. A belief that had guided her through decades of quiet resilience. Most people her age might have shuffled past, heads down, convincing themselves it wasn't their place to get involved. But Mayo wasn't most people. She took a slow, steadying breath, the cool air filling her lungs as she squared her shoulders. "Excuse me, officer," she called. her voice cutting through the stillness with a clarity that surprised even her. Her heart thudded wildly against her ribs, but she stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the unfolding drama. "Excuse me, officer," she said again, louder this time, her tone unwavering despite the tremor she felt creeping up her spine. Ryan turned his head slowly, his hand still poised near his weapon, his broad frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light around him. For a fleeting moment, his expression was unreadable, a mask of stone, but as his gaze settled on Mayo, a flicker of irritation sparked in his pale eyes. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening as he squared his shoulders, sizing her up. The boy, Jamal, she was almost certain now, glanced at her, his wide eyes glinting with a desperate, deer-like terror. His breath came in quick, uneven gasps, and Mayo could see the effort it took for him to hold himself together, to not crumble under the weight of Ryan's looming presence. He didn't look like a troublemaker, not to her. He looked like a kid who'd stumbled into a nightmare, trapped in a moment that could unravel him completely. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to mind your own business," Ryan said, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable laced with a warning that felt more like a growl. There was no warmth in the way he said "ma'am." No trace of respect, just a thinly veiled challenge daring her to push further. His eyes narrowed, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. But Mayo didn't flinch. She straightened her spine, her gray hair catching the fading sunlight as she met his stare. "I'm sorry, officer," she replied, her voice soft but threaded with steel. "But I don't see any reason why you're treating him this way. He's just a boy. He's not doing anything wrong." Ryan's face darkened, the scowl deepening into something uglier, something raw. He took a step toward her, his chest puffing out in a display of dominance that felt almost primal. "He's been loitering outside this store," he snapped, his words sharp enough to cut. "I asked him to leave, he refused. Now he's resisting, and I'm doing my job, which doesn't concern you." Mayo glanced at Jamal, who gave a slight, frantic shake of his head. His lips pressed into a tight, trembling line. She turned back to Ryan, her brow furrowing as unease coiled tighter in her gut. "It doesn't look to me like he's resisting anything," she said. Her voice steadied despite the storm brewing inside her. "It looks like he's just scared. Maybe if you talk to him instead of." "Enough!" Ryan barked, his voice exploding into the quiet street like a thunderclap. The sound jolted the bystanders into a stunned silence, their eyes wide as they shrank back from the edge of the scene. His hand dropped from his holster, but he stepped closer, his bulk towering over Mayo now, his breath hot and heavy in the space between them. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job, all right? He's causing a problem, and I'm handling it." Her heart pounded, a wild drumbeat against her ribs, but she didn't retreat. She wasn't naive, she knew the danger crackling in the air. The volatility of a man who wore his authority like a weapon. Yet she couldn't walk away, not when Jamal's frightened eyes pleaded silently for someone, anyone, to step in. "I'm not telling you how to do your job, officer," she said, forcing calm into her tone, hoping to pull the tension back from the brink. "I just think maybe this could be handled a little more gently. You don't need to frighten him." Ryan's eyes flashed, anger, humiliation. Something darker, his fists clenching at his sides until his knuckles whitened. She could see the veins pulsing in his neck, the frustration carving deep lines into his face. He was unraveling. And that realization sent a shiver of fear racing down her spine. "What did I just say, lady?" he snarled, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating off him, his face mere inches from hers. "You don't know a damn thing about what's going on here, so back off, or I'll arrest you for interfering with a police officer. Is that what you want, huh?" Mayo swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her instincts screaming at her to retreat, to let it go. But her conscience anchored her to the spot. She'd seen too much in her years, too many moments where power twisted into cruelty. Where justice was trampled under the weight of unchecked authority. She couldn't let herself be silenced, not by a man who thought a badge gave him license to terrorize. Raising her chin, she met his gaze, her voice quiet but resolute. "I think you're being too aggressive. There's no need for this. You're better than this, officer." That was the breaking point. She saw it flash in his eyes, a spark of rage igniting into something uncontrollable. Before she could react, Ryan's arm lashed out. His fist slamming into her cheek with a force that seemed to stop time itself. The blow was swift, brutal, a crack of pain exploding across her face as she stumbled backward. Her vision blurred. The world tilting as her feet tangled beneath her. She reached out, grasping at air, but the ground rushed up to meet her. Her head struck the curb with a sickening thud, a sharp, nauseating jolt that sent stars bursting behind her eyes. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, a woman's scream piercing the air as the scene shattered into chaos. Jamal dropped to his knees beside her. His face pale, his voice trembling as he cried out, "Miss Mayo." His hands hovered over her, trembling with uncertainty, afraid to touch her, afraid to make it worse. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, staining the silver strands of her hair a stark, glistening red. Her eyes fluttered, dazed and unfocused, as she struggled to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. The pain was a distant roar, drowned out by the weight of a deeper truth sinking into her bones: justice, when wielded by hands corrupted by power, could turn into a weapon of its own. And the consequences, etched in the boy's tear-streaked face, in the stunned silence of the crowd, were a lesson the world could not afford to ignore. The world around her wavered, a dizzying swirl of shapes and sounds that slipped in and out of her grasp. Mayo's senses faltered as the voices of the onlookers merged into a low, rumbling roar, like the distant hum of a storm rolling across the horizon. Her knees buckled beneath her, the pavement cold and unyielding against her palms as she struggled to hold on to the fading threads of reality. Above her, Officer Ryan stood rooted to the spot. His broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of his own actions pressed down on him. His face, once flushed with authority, now drained to a sickly pallor, the color leaching away as the gravity of what he'd done sank into his bones. His eyes darted wildly, scanning the crowd that had gathered, a sea of faces illuminated by the glow of phone screens. Each one capturing the scene in unforgiving detail. Panic flickered in his gaze, a raw, animal fear that betrayed the hardness he tried to project. "She came at me," he barked. His voice rough and jagged, as though shouting the words could hammer them into truth. She was out of control. He thrust a trembling finger toward Mayo's crumpled form, desperate to shift the blame. But the crowd wasn't swayed. Their expressions told a different tale, shock etched deep into furrowed brows, mouths agape in horror, and eyes blazing with disbelief. No one believed his flimsy defense. And he could feel their judgment tightening around him like a noose. The murmurs began as a ripple, soft at first, then swelling into a tide of outrage. "Did you see that? He just hit her." The words carried on the wind, growing louder, angrier, fueled by a collective fury that crackled in the air. Someone in the throng had already dialed 911. Their voice trembling with urgency as they relayed the scene to the operator. In the distance, the piercing wail of sirens cut through the chaos, drawing nearer with every passing second. A harbinger of consequences Ryan couldn't outrun. For Mayo, the world was slipping away. The sounds around her dulled to a muffled hum, and her vision dimmed, edges blurring as though she were sinking into a dark pool. She heard her name, Jamal's voice, sharp with desperation, calling out to her again and again, but it felt distant. As if it belonged to another life, another person. Her body grew heavy, her limbs unresponsive, and as her eyes fluttered shut, the last thing she glimpsed was the sky above. Streaked with the fiery hues of a setting sun, gold and crimson bleeding together in a fleeting, beautiful farewell. Then, darkness swallowed her whole. The ambulance tore through the city streets. Its sirens screaming into the twilight, a relentless cry that parted the traffic like a blade. Inside, the paramedics moved with practiced urgency, their hands steady despite the chaos. Mayo lay strapped to the gurney, her frail frame dwarfed by the tangle of wires and tubes that tethered her to life. An oxygen mask pressed against her face, fogging faintly with each shallow breath. While blood matted her silver hair, staining it a dark, ominous red. A jagged wound at her temple oozed steadily, a stark reminder of the violence that had brought her here. BP's dropping. One paramedic muttered, his brow furrowed as he adjusted the 4-line snaking into her arm. His partner nodded, her expression grim. Let's get her stabilized, she's fading fast. The words hung heavy in the cramped space, a quiet plea to hold death at bay just a little longer. When they reached the ER, the doors burst open into a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors swarmed the gurney as it rolled into the trauma room, their voices overlapping in a symphony of commands and questions. Hands moved swiftly, inserting another 4, checking vitals. Barking out observations. Head trauma, blunt force impact, possible brain bleed, a nurse called out, her tone clipped as she noted Mayo's age and the severity of her injuries. Mayo's breathing was faint, her pulse a fragile thread, and for a brief moment, she stirred. A soft groan escaped her lips as the harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered in her fractured vision. Her mind churned, thick with confusion, grasping at disjointed fragments, pain, fear, the echo of Jamal's voice, but the faces hovering above her blurred once more, and she slipped back into the haze. Lost to the world. Across town, in the dimly lit office of the district attorney, Thomas Clinic sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by a fortress of files and legal pads. The room smelled of stale coffee and ink, a testament to the hours he'd poured into his latest case, a sprawling investigation into a network of corrupt officers within the police force. Evidence sprawled across his desk, witness statements, grainy surveillance stills, meticulously highlighted reports. Thomas was a man of precision. His mind a steel trap even as exhaustion tugged at the edges of his focus. This case was personal, a crusade to dismantle the rot festering in the system. And the thought of finally exposing the truth kept him going. Justice wasn't just a job to him, it was a fire in his chest, a promise to those who'd been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. He was mid-sentence, typing a brief with steady, deliberate keystrokes, when his phone buzzed against a stack of papers, the vibration rattling through the quiet. He glanced at the screen. His brow creasing at the unfamiliar number. "Hello?" he answered, already rising from his chair, a reflex born of instinct. "Mr. Clinic," came a woman's voice, calm but edged with urgency. "This is Nurse Evans from St. Luke's Emergency. Your mother, Margaret Clinic, has been admitted. She was brought in after an incident. Her condition is critical." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and the world tilted beneath his feet. "Wait, what?" His voice sharpened, disbelief crashing over him like a wave. "What happened? What do you mean?" "Incident?" The nurse hesitated, choosing her words with care. "There's been an assault, sir. It's best if you come as soon as possible. We can explain more in person." Thomas stood frozen. His mind reeling as it tried to stitch together the impossible. His mother, Mayo Clinic, the soft-spoken retired schoolteacher who'd spent her life nurturing others, assaulted? A dull roar filled his ears, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. "I'm on my way," he managed, snatching his jacket from the chair and striding out the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur, the city lights streaking past as his mind raced faster than the car. Who could have done this? Why? Anger surged through him, hot and fierce. only to be overtaken by a chilling dread. Critical. The word echoed in his skull, a relentless tolling bell. When he arrived, he barely heard the receptionist's directions. His legs carrying him toward the ER on autopilot. Nurse Evans met him near the trauma bay, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Clinic," she said softly, "your mother sustained a serious head injury. She's in critical condition, but the doctors are doing everything they can." He nodded, jaw clenched, his eyes straining past her for any sign of Mayo. "Can I see her?" His voice was taut, barely holding back the storm inside. "She's being monitored closely," the nurse replied. "The impact caused significant trauma, there's concern about brain swelling. But for now, she's stable." Stable. It was a frail lifeline, but it wasn't enough to ease the vice gripping his chest. She led him to Mayo's room, and when he stepped inside, the sight stole the air from his lungs. His mother lay motionless in the hospital bed, her skin pale and waxy, her small frame swallowed by the machinery keeping her alive. Bandages wrapped her head, and her face bore the swollen, bruised evidence of the blow she'd taken. Thomas felt his stomach lurch, his throat tightening as he took in the fragility of the woman who'd raised him. This was the same Mayo who'd taught him to stand tall, to fight for what was right, now reduced to a broken figure in a sterile room. He stood at her bedside, speechless, his hands curling into fists. The ache in his heart was unbearable, but he forced it down, channeling it into a resolve as hard as iron. As he lingered there, his phone buzzed again. It was Greg, his assistant DA. Stepping just outside the room, he answered. "Thomas, you need to hear this," Greg said, his voice low and urgent. "It's one of our own. The officer who assaulted your mother, it's Ryan." The name sliced through him like a blade. Officer Ryan, a man Thomas had been tracking for months, a repeat offender with a file full of complaints, excessive force, intimidation, buried reports. Evidence had always slipped through the cracks, but now Ryan had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. Thomas felt a cold clarity settle over him, sharp and unyielding. "Are you sure?" he asked. His tone steady despite the tempest raging within. "Witnesses, cell phone footage, it's him," Greg confirmed. "How do you want to handle this?" Thomas paused, glancing back at his mother's still form. Justice had always been his compass, but now it was personal. Ryan's abuse of power had shattered more than Mayo's body, it had exposed the cost of letting corruption fester. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a reckoning. Thomas stood motionless in the sterile glow of his office. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead like a swarm of restless insects. His sharp eyes traced the chaotic sprawl of the corkboard dominating the wall, a tangled web of newspaper clippings, grainy photographs, and meticulously drawn timelines. All pinned together with crimson strings that crisscrossed like veins. For months, this board had been his silent obsession, a map of corruption festering within the police department. Names, dates, and incidents intertwined in a sinister dance of misconduct, and there, among the mess, was Ryan's name, circled in bold red ink. Until today, it had been just another thread in the tapestry of rot. Now, it was personal. The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer, not merely because of the sprawling implications for his investigation, but because the frail figure lying in a hospital bed, tethered to machines, was his own mother. His mind churned furiously, racing through the possibilities. This wasn't just a single act of brutality, it could be the linchpin. The moment that unraveled the department's carefully guarded secrets. Yet, beneath the cold logic of his thoughts, a storm brewed. His chest tightened as he pictured her, her gentle hands once so steady, now trembling against starched hospital sheets. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, and forced the emotion down. There was no room for weakness now. "I'll handle it by the book," he said at last, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, firm and unyielding. Gather every shred of evidence, video footage, witness statements, all of it. I want a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning. On the other end of the line, Greg hesitated. The faint crackle of the phone amplifying the tension. Thomas could almost see him, Greg, his assistant DA, perched nervously in his cluttered office, waiting for the outburst he'd braced himself for. Surely, Thomas would erupt, demand blood for blood, scream for vengeance. But that wasn't Thomas. Even as the ground beneath his personal world quaked, threatening to swallow him whole. His mind snapped into focus, shifting gears with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor. You sure you want to handle this yourself? Greg's voice came through, cautious, tinged with unease. Yes. Thomas replied, his tone hardening like steel forged in fire. We don't bend the law for anyone, not even family. He hung up without waiting for a response. His jaw locking as he turned back toward the hospital room. The weight of what he'd just learned bore down on him, a crushing pressure that threatened to splinter his resolve. But he couldn't falter, not now. His mother needed him to be the rock she'd always relied on, and his duty demanded nothing less. Stepping into her room, he was greeted by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a steady pulse that seemed to mock the chaos swirling inside him. She lay there, fragile as a bird with clipped wings. Her breath shallow but persistent. He sank into the chair beside her, the cold metal biting into his thighs, and watched her chest rise and fall. In that quiet moment, a vow took root deep within him, not one fueled by rage or grief, but by an unshakable commitment to justice. This wasn't about settling scores, it was about righting a wrong. No matter how steep the cost. Justice, he thought, was a blade that cut both ways, and he would wield it with precision. Back in his office, the corkboard loomed larger than ever. A sprawling testament to the corruption he'd spent over a year chasing. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and ink, the detritus of countless late nights scattered across his desk. Ryan's name stared back at him, a taunting specter now tied to the image of his mother crumpled on the pavement. The collision of his two worlds, personal and professional, felt like a seismic rupture. But Thomas refused to let it shake him. Sir? Greg's voice broke the silence as he poked his head through the doorway, his wiry frame silhouetted against the dim hallway light. We've got the preliminary witness reports. Bring them in, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. Greg stepped forward, placing a thick manila folder on the desk with a soft thud. He lingered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his brow furrowed with concern. You sure you want to take this on personally? I mean, Ryan's no small fish. He's got the police union wrapped around his finger. If you go after him, it's not just blowback, it could end your career. Thomas didn't look up, his fingers flipping through the file with swift, deliberate motions. I know what's at stake, he said, his tone even, resolute. Ryan crossed a line. If he thinks his buddies can shield him, he's got another thing coming. Greg sighed, sinking into the chair across from Thomas, his hands raking through his thinning hair. You've been at this corruption case for over a year. The union's already got us in a chokehold, half the department won't even talk to us. Ryan's dirty, no question. 3 excessive force cases we couldn't nail him on, and now this? If you let it get personal, it could unravel everything we've built. Thomas snapped the folder shut and leaned back, his gaze piercing through the haze of fatigue. This isn't personal, Greg, he said, his voice cutting like a whip. It's justice. The video alone is enough to launch an investigation, and now we've got witnesses backing it up. Ryan assaulted an elderly woman, my mother's condition doesn't change the facts. Greg scrubbed a hand over his face, his skepticism palpable. Sure, but you know Ryan's already spinning his story. Self-defense, that's his play. He's been on the phone all day, rallying his crew. By tomorrow, he'll have half the department swearing he's a saint. Thomas rose, pacing the room with slow, measured steps, the creak of the floorboards punctuating his thoughts. Then we stick to the plan, he said. We build the case, facts, evidence, nothing else. If he tries to bury this, it'll only tighten the noose. And if this ties back to the bigger corruption network, we've got a shot at bringing it all down. Greg's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of hope breaking through his doubt. You think this could be the key? Thomas stopped, his jaw tightening. I don't think, I know. By the next morning, Thomas had gathered his team, a small, fiercely loyal band of investigators who'd been digging into the department's underbelly alongside him for months. They met in a cramped, windowless room. The air thick with tension and the faint smell of sweat. These were people he trusted implicitly, hand-picked for their grit and their refusal to bow to pressure. Lisa, a young investigator with a fire in her eyes, stood at the front, her notes spread out like a battle plan. We're going after Ryan, Thomas began, his voice low but commanding. I want everything, every report, every complaint, every whisper about him and his cronies. Cross-check it with our corruption files. If there's a trail to the top, we're following it. Lisa nodded, her pen tapping against her notepad. We've already pulled his personnel files. There's a pattern, misconduct swept under the rug, complaints buried. It's all hushed up, nothing official. If we can tie this assault to a cover-up, we might unravel the whole damn thing. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to Thomas with a mix of respect and concern. We've got your back on this. Thomas met her eyes, his expression unyielding. Good. Keep me posted. This isn't just about my mother, it's about every last one of them. Later that day, Thomas sat across from Jamal in a quiet corner of the precinct, the boy's lanky frame hunched over a chipped table. At 17, Jamal carried a weariness no kid should know. His hands trembling as he clutched a water bottle. His dark eyes darted nervously, haunted by the memory of what he'd witnessed. Thanks for coming in, Thomas said, keeping his tone gentle but firm. I know this isn't easy, but we need to hear your side of it. Jamal nodded, staring at the table as if it held the answers he couldn't voice. I was just waiting for my friend outside the store. He started, his words shaky. That's it. Officer Ryan came out of nowhere, yelling at me to get lost. I told him I wasn't doing nothing wrong, just waiting, but he didn't care. Thomas leaned forward, watching the boy's every twitch, the way his shoulders tensed as the story spilled out. What happened next? Jamal's head snapped up, anger and fear flashing in his eyes. That's when Mrs. Clinic showed up. She was just trying to help, you know. She wasn't loud or nothing, just talking to him, calm-like. I don't know why he flipped. He just snapped. When she hit the ground, his voice cracked, and he swiped at his face with a sleeve, hiding the tears. I thought she was gone. I didn't know what to do. Thomas scribbled notes, his pen scratching against the paper, but his heart twisted at the boy's pain. You stayed, Jamal. You helped her. That took guts, most people would have bolted. None of this is on you, you hear me? Jamal's jaw tightened, guilt still pooling in his gaze. Is she gonna be okay? Thomas paused, the question slicing through him like a knife. The doctors are doing all they can, he said. His voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Jamal swallowed hard, looking away. I got it on video, he murmured. Didn't think it'd matter, but I started recording when he was yelling. Kept going till after she fell. The words hung in the air, a lifeline Thomas seized with both hands. That footage, raw and unfiltered, was more than evidence, it was a testament to the truth. A beacon in the darkness of corruption. As Jamal slumped back, exhaustion etched into his young face, Thomas felt the weight of the lesson settle over him. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning. Power, when twisted and abused, left scars on the innocent, but consequences would follow. Ryan, the Union. The whole rotten system, they'd learn that no one stood above the law, not even when the stakes were personal. Thomas would see to it, step by painstaking step. Until the web of lies collapsed under its own weight. The air in Thomas Clinick's office felt thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken stakes of the battle he was waging. His voice softened just a fraction as he spoke to Jamal, the young man who had risked so much to bring him the video. This is exactly what we needed, Thomas said. His words carrying a quiet gratitude that masked the storm brewing inside him. He could still feel the tremor of rage in his chest. A visceral reaction to the footage he'd watched over and over, his mother, Mayo Clinic, standing resolute and unshaken, her dignity intact even as Ryan's fist shattered the moment. The truth was there. Captured in every frame, and Thomas knew it would be the key to dismantling the lies Ryan was scrambling to stitch together. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the screen. Replaying the scene in his mind, Mayo's calm defiance, Ryan's escalating fury, and then the sickening crack of violence that had turned Thomas's stomach. But he couldn't let that nausea take hold, not now. Justice demanded clarity, not emotion, and he forced himself to focus on the cold, hard facts. Meanwhile, miles away in a cramped apartment that smelled of stale coffee in desperation, Ryan paced like a caged animal. His phone was pressed so tightly to his ear that his knuckles whitened. His voice sharp and ragged as he barked at Officer Hendrick, his lifeline in the police union. "You need to get ahead of this," Hendrick growled through the line, his voice rough as gravel. Tinged with the weariness of a man who'd cleaned up too many messes. "I'm hearing whispers, Clinick's not just coming for the assault. He's digging, Ryan. Old reports, buried complaints, everything." Ryan's breath hitched, his mind racing through a decade of shortcuts and cover-ups, all the times he'd leaned on the Brotherhood to shield him. "I know that," he snapped, his tone biting. "But I didn't call to hear what Clinick's doing. I need to know what you're doing to fix this. You think I'm sinking alone?" His fist clenched until his nails dug into his palm. The sting grounding him as panic gnawed at his edges. For years, he'd been untouchable, a king among pawns, protected by a system that bent to the will of men like him. But now, with Thomas Clinick leading the charge, Thomas, of all people, Mayo's son, the ground beneath him was crumbling. Hendrick sighed, a heavy sound that carried doubt Ryan didn't want to hear. "The union's got your back, but you've got to play this smart. Stick to the story, self-defense. That old lady came at you, and you had no choice. It's your word against some kid with a phone and a couple of shaky bystanders. But if Clinick keeps pulling threads, it's gonna unravel for all of us." Ryan's jaw tightened. His mind flashing to the faces of the boys who'd always had his back, the ones who'd doctored reports, intimidated witnesses, buried complaints. "Then make sure he doesn't," Ryan hissed. "We've buried worse. Get some of them to vouch for me." Hendrick hesitated, his confidence faltering. "I'll see what I can do," he muttered, "but keep your head down. Don't do anything stupid." The call ended, and Ryan's hand trembled as he lowered the phone. He stood there, staring at the peeling wallpaper, feeling the weight of his own arrogance pressing down. This wasn't just about one bad night anymore, it was his entire empire of invincibility teetering on the edge. Back at the DA's office, Thomas sat hunched over his desk. The glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face. The video Jamal had given him played on a loop, each viewing etching the details deeper into his resolve. Beside it, a stack of bystander clips corroborated every second, Mayo's steady voice, her hands still at her sides, offering no threat, no provocation. Then Ryan, his posture radiating aggression. His fist swinging with a force that seemed to echo through Thomas's bones. It was brutal, undeniable, and yet Ryan had the gall to claim self-defense. Thomas's stomach churned again. But he swallowed it down, channeling his fury into purpose. This wasn't just about his mother, it was about the countless others Ryan had crushed under his badge. The lives warped by a system that turned a blind eye. He glanced up as Greg, his assistant DA, stepped into the room, dropping a thick file onto the desk with a thud. "How's it looking?" Greg asked. His voice cautious but steady, a man who'd seen enough battles to know this one was different. "Strong," Thomas replied, his eyes never leaving the screen. "His self-defense claims a sham. The footage shows he struck first, no provocation. It's airtight." Greg nodded, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. "Just got off the phone with some guys in the department." Ryan's scrambling, trying to rally support, but it's slipping. Even his usual cronies are stepping back, too much heat. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. A faint satisfaction flickering in his chest. "Good. That means we're close. Tell Lisa to dig deeper into his past incidents. If there's even a hint of a cover-up, we can nail him for obstruction too." Greg arched an eyebrow, a mix of admiration and unease in his gaze. "You think this ties into the corruption case?" Thomas's voice hardened, his conviction cutting through the air. "I know it does. Ryan's been coasting on dirty cops for years. This is our shot to drag them all into the light." Greg exhaled slowly, the weight of Thomas's words settling over him like dust. He was a wiry man, sharp-eyed and pragmatic, the kind who'd spent years navigating the gray areas of justice. He believed in Thomas, but he also knew the cost of pushing too far. "All right," he said. His tone measured. "I'll keep the team on it. We're with you." Thomas gave a curt nod, his mind already racing ahead. "Let's make sure no one slips through the cracks." As Greg left, Thomas turned back to the footage, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got, discrepancies in old reports, witnesses who'd mysteriously recanted. A trail of leniency where discipline should have landed. Ryan hadn't just been protected, he'd been enabled, a predator cloaked in blue, thriving in the shadows of a corrupt machine. But now, with the city's outrage swelling over Mayo's assault, those shadows were shrinking. Days bled into nights, and the pressure on Ryan tightened like a noose. His apartment became a prison. The walls closing in as he chain-smoked and scrolled through news feeds blasting his name. The public wasn't letting go, protests flared outside the precinct, voices demanding accountability. Justice for Mayo Clinic. His phone buzzed incessantly, but the calls from his brothers grew fewer, their tones colder. Hendrick's promises felt hollow now, and Ryan could sense the tide turning. He'd always known how to play the game, lean on the right people, twist the right arms, but Thomas Clinic wasn't playing. Thomas was dismantling the board entirely. And Ryan's gut twisted with the realization that his shield was cracking. In Thomas's office, the atmosphere buzzed with urgency. Phones rang off the hook, colleagues, city officials, community leaders, all clamoring for a piece of him. Greg Mason, the assistant DA, lingered by the door one afternoon, his lean frame taut with unease. "Tom, you sure about this?" he asked. His voice low, like he was testing fragile ice. "The union's coming hard. They've sent a letter to the mayor, hinting this is personal for you, a vendetta. They're spinning it already." Thomas didn't look up from the files sprawled across his desk, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against a case summary. "I'm not worried about their spin," he said, his tone steady as steel. "I'm worried about the truth." Greg stepped closer, his brow furrowing. Truth doesn't always win in the court of public opinion. They've got sway, media, connections. If we push too hard, they'll drag you down with him. Maybe we could cut a deal, plead Ryan out. No, Thomas cut in, his head snapping up, eyes blazing with a quiet ferocity. I'm not bargaining with a man who attacked an innocent woman, my mother. The video's clear, the witnesses are solid. This isn't about me. It's about the law. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. Caught between loyalty and caution. I get it, Tom. No one wants him to walk. But it's not just the union. Community groups are calling too, some want you to go bigger. Use this to torch the whole department. Corruption, brutality, the works. Thomas stood, crossing to the window, the city sprawling before him like a map of memories. He thought of his mother's hands shaping young minds, her voice steady in chaos, her strength now a rallying cry. The weight of it all pressed against his ribs. Some wanted peace, a quiet deal. Others wanted war, a reckoning. Neither felt right. We can't overreach, he said finally, turning back to Greg. But we can't back down either. This is about justice, real justice. Not revenge or politics. Ryan's a symptom. The system's the disease. We take him down clean, and the cracks will spread on their own. Greg nodded, a flicker of resolve hardening his features. Time's running out for him, he said, glancing at the latest evidence pile. And when he falls, he's taking half the precinct with him. Thomas's gaze turned flinty, a quiet vow in his eyes. Good. It's past time. Outside, the city hummed with unrest, a chorus of voices rising against the rot Ryan embodied. For Thomas, it was a reminder, power abused carried a price, and justice, though slow, was relentless. Thomas pivoted sharply, his boots scuffing the worn hardwood floor as he faced Greg, his voice low but resolute. Carrying the weight of months spent unraveling a tangled web of corruption. I've poured everything into this case, nights, weekends, every ounce of focus I've got, and yes, Ryan's neck deep in it. But I'm not about to jeopardize the whole damn thing by turning it into some grand crusade it's not ready to be. We zero in on the assault, Greg. We nail Ryan's guilt so tight there's not a sliver of doubt left. Once that's locked down, once he's convicted, we've got our foothold. Then we keep clawing, bit by bit. Until the rest comes crashing down. Greg's shoulders loosened slightly, the taut lines of his face softening as he absorbed Thomas's words. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The flicker of relief in his eyes betraying how much he'd been bracing for a different answer. So, you're thinking long-term here. Playing chess, not checkers. Thomas exhaled. His breath steadying as he met Greg's gaze. Exactly. If I let this balloon into some all-out war against the department, we lose our grip. I'm not here to rack up headlines or settle old scores. I'm here to do the job, my way, the right way, like always. Sticking to the assault didn't make the road ahead any smoother. Each dawn dragged in fresh scraps of information, some were gold. Others just noise cluttering the path. Thomas spent his days hunched over files, the faint hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as he sifted through Ryan's history. What he uncovered wasn't just a single bad apple, it was a festering rot. One humid afternoon, Lisa, the corruption case's lead investigator, strode into his cramped office. Her arms burdened with a teetering stack of folders. She let them drop onto his desk with a resounding thump that rattled his coffee mug, her expression grim but electric with purpose. You're gonna want to dive into this, she said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her sweat-damp forehead. We've dug up Ryan's full personnel record, every page since he pinned on that badge. And trust me, it's uglier than a junkyard dog. Thomas glanced up from the deposition he'd been annotating, his pen pausing mid-sentence as curiosity sharpened his focus. How ugly are we talking? Lisa didn't hesitate, flipping open the top file with a practiced flick of her wrist. 7 excessive force complaints in 10 years, minimum. Most of them buried so deep they never even sniffed internal affairs. The few that did surface? Resolved, if you can call a wink and a handshake an investigation. Thomas leaned forward. His chair creaking under the shift, eyes narrowing as he processed the numbers. Who buried them? He asked, voice tight. Lisa slid a file across the desk, her finger tapping a list of names. That's the kicker. Same crew keeps showing up, supervisors, brass, big shots. They've got Ryan's back every time, swearing his story's gospel. Cases vanish like smoke. Thomas snatched the file. His fingers rifling through pages as his mind raced. So they've been shielding him. Not just him, Lisa countered, her tone darkening. It's a pattern. Other officers, same deal. Misconduct flags waving, but no fallout. Ryan's the loudest alarm, but he's not the only one ringing. Thomas set the file down, rubbing his stubbled chin as the pieces clicked into place. This was it, the thread he'd been chasing, the proof that corruption wasn't a lone wolf but a pack, a machine built to protect its own gears no matter how rusted. This is what I've been after. He muttered, half to himself. Evidence it's not just bad cops, it's a system that's rotten top to bottom. But if I swing too wide too fast, it'll blow up in our faces. We stick to the plan. Keep digging on these other officers, but Ryan stays the target. If we can prove they've covered for him before, it's not just one assault, it's a damn career of getting away with it. Lisa nodded. Though her jaw clenched with unspoken frustration, her hazel eyes flashing with the urge to charge ahead. I just hope we don't stall out. If we don't hit hard now, who knows when we'll get another shot? Thomas's voice hardened, steady as steel. We'll get it. But we do it clean, Lisa. No half measures. We're not dropping one domino just to watch the rest scatter. Word of Thomas's resolve spread like wildfire through the precinct's echoing halls. By week's end, the police union was circling the wagons, their machinery grinding into overdrive to shield Ryan. On a gray Wednesday morning, Thomas found himself squaring off with Chief Patrick Reynolds. The union's bulldog of a leader, in a stuffy conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and sweat. The table between them was scratched and bare. A battleground of folded hands and hard stares, the air thick enough to choke on. Reynolds broke the silence first, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. Tom, let's not dance around it. We both know what's driving this. Your mom got hurt, hell, I'd be pissed too. Any son would. But dragging Ryan through the mud? It's not fixing a damn thing. You push this. You're cracking the department wide open. We can't afford that kind of fracture right now. Thomas didn't blink, his spine rigid as he held Reynolds's gaze. This isn't about fractures, Chief. It's about accountability. Ryan assaulted someone, my mother, yeah, but that doesn't change the fact it's a crime. I'm prosecuting it because it's my job, not because it's my family. Reynolds shook his head, a flicker of irritation creasing his weathered face. You know Ryan's side ain't that simple. He's calling it self-defense, and we're standing by him. You can't just bury him under charges because it hits close to home. Thomas's voice stayed level, a calm that belied the fire beneath. Nothing personal about it. It's professional. We've got evidence, hard evidence, of excessive force. I follow that trail wherever it takes me. Reynolds leaned in, his tone dropping to a growl. And if that trail ends with half the force walking out? With riots tearing up the streets? You ready to be the DA who lights that match? Thomas didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the chief's. I'm here to enforce the law, not coddle the ones who think they're untouchable. The silence stretched taut, a wire ready to snap, until Reynolds stood with a grunt. "Fine, Tom. But don't say I didn't tell you, this ain't ending how you picture it." He stormed out, leaving his warning to linger like smoke. The days bled into weeks, and the case against Ryan grew sharper. Heavier. Witness accounts piled up, grainy security footage rolled in, and each file from his past sketched a portrait of a man who'd danced on the edge of the law for years, always with a safety net. Thomas felt the pressure mounting, the union's threats, the public's restless eyes, but he anchored himself in the truth. Ryan had crossed a line, and justice demanded an answer. Late one evening, Greg slipped into the office, a manila folder clutched in his hand, his face etched with fatigue and quiet triumph. Final reports on Ryan's old cases just came through. "It's all here, enough to push this over the line." Thomas took the folder, his chest tightening with the gravity of it all. "Good. We do this clean, Greg. No cutting corners, no slip-ups." Greg's lips twitched into a half-smile, though his eyes stayed shadowed. "You're really going all in, huh?" Thomas rose, his silhouette tall against the dim office light. "Every damn step. This isn't just Ryan's reckoning, it's about making sure no one else suffers like my mom did." The moment arrived like a storm breaking. Thomas sat alone at his desk. The charging documents fanned out before him, their stark black ink a map of the fight ahead. Weeks of interviews, evidence, and sleepless nights had built this tower. And now it was time to set it in motion. His hand hovered over the pen, steady despite the storm churning inside him, not doubt of Ryan's guilt, but the weight of what came next, the union's wrath. The city's unrest, the personal cost. He signed his name in one fluid stroke, the scratch of the pen a quiet thunder. Aggravated assault. Ryan had earned every letter of it. And Thomas would see him face the music. By morning, the cuffs clicked around Ryan's wrists at his modest suburban home, his lawyer already barking objections as the news vans circled. The wheels were turning now, and there was no stopping them. This wasn't just a case, it was a lesson carved in blood and ink. Justice wasn't a gavel's bang or a headline's flash, it was a slow, grinding machine that demanded vigilance. Ryan's fall would ripple, a warning to those who wielded power like a club. The law bends for no one, not forever. And for Thomas, it was a vow, to his mother, to himself, that the corrupt wouldn't outrun their shadows while he still drew breath. On a crisp morning in late spring, the air hung heavy with anticipation as Officer Ryan trudged toward the squad car, his wrists bound by cold steel handcuffs. His face remained an unreadable mask. A stoic facade carefully constructed to conceal the storm brewing beneath. Thomas, watching from a distance, could sense the turmoil churning in Ryan's chest, panic, raw and unspoken, clawing at the edges of his composure. No one had ever dared to challenge Ryan like this before. For years, he'd walked the streets cloaked in the authority of his badge, untouchable. A figure both feared and revered. Now, that illusion was unraveling, thread by fragile thread, and the weight of it pressed against his ribs like a vice. Across town, Monroe, Ryan's steadfast defender, wasted no time leaping into action. A seasoned attorney with a silver tongue and a knack for bending truth into something palatable, he stood before a sea of microphones. His voice steady and commanding. He painted Ryan as a man stretched thin by the demands of his duty, a weary officer forced to make a split-second call in a moment of chaos. Ryan was under unimaginable stress, Monroe declared, his words dripping with rehearsed sincerity. He acted to protect himself and the public in a situation that spiraled beyond anyone's control. The police union rallied behind this narrative, their support unwavering. Chief Reynolds, a towering figure with a gravelly voice and a penchant for grandstanding, stepped up to the cameras next. His broad shoulders squared against the flashing lights, he spoke of the burdens officers carry in an unforgiving world. This was a tragic misunderstanding, he insisted, his tone grave yet polished. Officer Ryan was simply trying to keep the peace, to ensure safety for all. The DA's office is reaching too far. When the full story comes out, you'll see he was just doing his job. But Thomas wasn't swayed by their polished speeches or carefully curated sympathy. He stood apart, a quiet force fueled by something deeper than their public relations games, truth. In his hands, he held the unassailable proof, a video, sharp and unyielding, that captured Ryan's aggression toward Mayo Clinic in vivid detail. The footage was a silent witness, its clarity cutting through the noise like a blade. It showed Mayo, frail yet dignified, standing her ground with no hint of menace, only to be met with Ryan's unwarranted fury. For Thomas, this wasn't about spin or sentiment, it was about justice, about holding a mirror to power and forcing it to confront its reflection. Days later, the courthouse loomed like a fortress under a slate-gray sky, its stone steps swarming with reporters whose cameras flashed like lightning. Inside, the air buzzed with attention so thick it seemed to hum against the wood-paneled walls. Thomas strode through the double doors, his team at his heels, their footsteps echoing with purpose. The courtroom was a theater of divided loyalties. On one side, rows of police union members sat in rigid silence, their arms crossed, eyes fixed on Ryan as if their collective will could shield him from what was coming. On the other, community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens filled the benches. Their faces a mix of hope and fury, each breath a quiet prayer for accountability. The weight of their expectations pressed against Thomas, but he carried it with a steady grace. Monroe took the floor first, a veteran showman in a crisp suit, his voice smooth as polished marble. He leaned into his opening statement with the confidence of a man who'd danced this dance before. Officer Ryan faced a chaotic scene that day, he began, gesturing broadly as if to sweep the jury into his tale. Jamal, a young man loitering outside a store, refused to follow lawful orders. My client, acting in his sworn duty, tried to calm things down. Then Mrs. Clinic stepped in, her intentions unclear, her actions unpredictable. We all feel for her, of course. No one denies the tragedy here. But the question isn't about sympathy, it's about whether Officer Ryan reasonably believed he was in danger. Whether his response was justified under the pressure of that moment. His words slithered through the room, subtle and insidious, planting seeds of doubt about Mayo's frail form and Jamal's quiet defiance. Thomas sat still, his gaze steady, refusing to let Monroe's bait hook him. He knew the attorney's game: twist the story, blur the edges, make the victim the villain. But Thomas had an ace up his sleeve, evidence that didn't bend or break under scrutiny. When his turn came, he rose slowly, his presence commanding without fanfare. He faced the jury, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the room like a steady drumbeat. This case isn't about chaos or confusion, he said, his eyes locking with each juror in turn. It's about an officer who abused his power to brutalize an innocent woman. You'll see it for yourselves, video footage that leaves no room for doubt. Mayo Clinic was no threat, not to Ryan, not to anyone. You'll hear from people who were there, who saw it unfold, and you'll know that Ryan's actions didn't come from stress or fear. They came from arrogance, from a belief that his badge made him untouchable. His words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, and the trial roared to life. The first days were a battlefield of nerves and wills. Monroe pounced on Thomas's witnesses with the ferocity of a predator, his cross-examinations sharp and relentless. Jamal, a wiry young man with haunted eyes, took the stand, his hands trembling as he gripped the wooden rail. His voice wavered at first, fragile as a reed in the wind, but it grew stronger as he spoke. I was just waiting for my friend, he said, staring at the floor as if the memory pinned him there. Officer Ryan came up out of nowhere, yelling at me, asking why I was hanging around. I told him I wasn't doing anything wrong, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept pushing, getting louder, closer. That's when Mrs. Clinic came over. She was trying to help, to calm him down. The courtroom hung on his every word, the air thick with the weight of his fear, his truth. Monroe stepped forward, his smile thin and cutting. "You were just standing there, doing nothing, huh?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. "Isn't it true you've had brushes with the law before, Jamal?" The question hit like a slap, and Jamal blinked, his breath catching. I mean, I've been stopped a couple times, but I wasn't doing anything wrong," he stammered, his voice faltering under the pressure. Monroe pressed harder, his voice syrupy with doubt. "So it's just a coincidence that Officer Ryan, a seasoned veteran, found your behavior suspicious?" Thomas rose smoothly, his calm a stark contrast to Monroe's venom. "Objection, Your Honor," he said. His tone even but firm. "This is irrelevant to what happened that day." The judge, a stern man with silver hair and a no-nonsense glare, nodded. "Sustained. Counsel, move on." Monroe's jab had landed. But it didn't stick. The jury's eyes lingered on Jamal, not with suspicion, but with something softer, something searching. Then came the video, a cold, unblinking eye that stripped away the lies. The courtroom fell silent as the screen flickered to life, every breath held captive by the images unfolding. There was Mayo, her gray hair catching the sunlight, her posture steady but gentle. She stood several feet from Ryan, her hands at her sides, her voice a quiet plea for reason. And there was Ryan, his face twisted with something dark, his fist lashing out in a swift, brutal arc that sent Mayo crumpling to the ground. The footage rolled on, merciless in its clarity, showing no lunge, no threat, just a woman felled by a man who'd lost himself to his own power. The silence that followed was deafening, a collective inhale as the jury absorbed the weight of what they'd seen. Monroe scrambled, his composure fraying at the edges. He shifted tactics. Painting Mayo as a confused old woman whose actions had unwittingly sparked the clash. During the cross-examination of a medical witness, a nervous doctor with wire-rimmed glasses, Monroe leaned in. "Isn't it possible Mrs. Clinic's age impaired her judgment?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil. "Could she have misread the situation, escalated it without meaning to?" Thomas shot to his feet. His objection swift and sharp. "Your Honor, this is baseless speculation. Mrs. Clinic's mental state isn't on trial, Officer Ryan's actions are." The judge's gavel came down like thunder. "Sustained." Monroe pivoted, but the cracks in his argument were widening, and the jury could see it. The trial's crescendo arrived when Ryan himself took the stand. Advised by Monroe to testify. He sat with a rehearsed calm, his uniform crisp, his eyes darting briefly to the gallery before settling ahead. "I didn't want it to happen like that," he said, his voice steady but hollow. The situation was getting out of hand. Mrs. Clinic got too close, I felt threatened. I had to act fast. He spoke as if reciting lines, each word polished to deflect blame. Thomas watched from the prosecution table, his hands folded, his mind a quiet storm of focus. When it was his turn, Thomas approached the stand with deliberate steps, his presence a slow burn. "Officer Ryan," he began, his voice a measured blade, "you say you felt threatened by Mrs. Clinic?" Ryan met his gaze for a fleeting second before looking away. "Yes," he said, nodding. "And you believed she was a danger to you?" Thomas pressed, his tone unrelenting. "That's correct," Ryan replied, his confidence thinning. "She came at me quickly." Thomas arched a brow, letting the absurdity hang in the air. "Quickly? How fast do you think a 72-year-old woman could move, Officer Ryan?" Ryan shifted, his fingers tightening on the armrest. She startled me," he muttered, the words crumbling as they left his mouth. Thomas inhaled deeply, his voice steady but piercing. The video shows Mrs. Clinic standing still, hands at her sides. No sudden moves. Can you explain how a woman her age, unarmed, several feet away, posed a threat to you? Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something desperate. It's hard to explain, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas cut in, soft but unyielding. Take your time, officer. We're all listening. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. As Ryan faltered, unable to bridge the gap between his story and the truth, Thomas stepped back, letting the moment linger, letting the jury see a man undone by his own choices. In that courtroom, amid the murmurs and the rustle of papers, a lesson unfolded. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a reckoning. Ryan's fall wasn't merely about one punch, but about the cost of wielding power without restraint. For Mayo, for Jamal, for every soul watching, it was a reminder that unchecked authority could bruise more than bodies, it could fracture trust, community, and the fragile hope that held them together. Thomas knew this as he returned to his seat, the weight of the fight settling into his bones. The trial wasn't over, but the tide had turned. And with it, the promise that consequences would find their mark. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. When Officer Ryan Thomas finally broke his silence, his voice trembled slightly as he stepped forward, the polished wood of the witness stand creaking under his shifting weight. I acted out of anger. Not fear, he admitted, his words slicing through the stillness like a blade. He edged closer to the prosecutor, his broad shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible burden. Isn't it true? The prosecutor pressed, his tone sharp yet measured, that you lost control of yourself? That you lashed out at my mother not because your life was at stake, but because your pride was wounded? Ryan's face flushed a deep crimson, the color rising like a tide from his neck to his forehead. For a fleeting moment, the carefully constructed mask of composure he'd worn throughout the trial slipped, revealing the turmoil churning beneath. I didn't lose my temper, he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. But the words rang hollow, devoid of the conviction he so desperately wanted to project. His eyes darted to the jury, then quickly away, as if he couldn't bear the judgment he saw reflected in their faces. The prosecutor, Thomas Clinic, didn't press harder. He didn't need to. The jury had witnessed it all, the subtle tremor in Ryan's hands, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. They'd seen the video too. The grainy footage that captured the moment Ryan's fist connected with Mayo Clinic's frail frame, her body crumpling to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. Thomas let the silence linger, allowing the weight of that image to settle into the jurors' minds. He knew the power of restraint, of letting the evidence speak for itself. In his closing argument, Ryan's defense attorney, Monroe, took a different tack. He paced the courtroom with the confidence of a man accustomed to swaying opinions, his voice rising and falling like a preacher delivering a sermon. Officers face impossible choices every day, he declared, gesturing toward Ryan, who sat stiffly at the defendant's table, staring at his clasped hands. In the heat of the moment, split-second decisions can mean life or death. This job, it's a pressure cooker. Ryan believed he was protecting himself, acting in self-defense against a perceived threat. Monroe paused, letting his gaze sweep over the jury, his eyes pleading for empathy. Who among us hasn't faltered under stress? Who hasn't acted out of instinct when the world closes in? But Thomas wasn't swayed by theatrics. When it was his turn, he stood tall, his broad frame casting a shadow across the prosecution table. His voice was steady, calm, a quiet force that cut through Monroe's bluster like a lighthouse beam piercing fog. This case isn't about the pressures of the job, he began, his hands resting lightly on the table, grounding him. It's about accountability. It's about a simple, unshakable truth: no one stands above the law, not you, not me. Not an officer with a badge pinned to his chest. Officer Ryan wasn't fighting for his life that day. He wasn't cornered or threatened. He was angry, furious, even, and he let that anger guide his hand. The video doesn't lie. The witnesses who watched it unfold don't lie. You've seen the evidence with your own eyes. Now, it falls to you to decide. Do we live in a world where justice bends for the powerful, or one where it stands firm for everyone? The courthouse fell silent as his words settled over the room. The earlier hum of whispers and rustling papers fading into a hush. The jurors sat motionless, their faces a mixture of resolve and unease, the gravity of their task sinking in. Outside. On the courthouse steps, Thomas Clinic stood alone, the late afternoon wind whipping around him. It was cool and sharp, tugging at his coat and brushing against his cheeks as he drew a deep breath. The verdict had just come down: guilty. Ryan would face the consequences of his actions. But even as relief washed over Thomas, a deeper exhaustion pressed down on him. A weight forged from weeks of sleepless nights, tense arguments, and the unrelenting scrutiny of the trial. He tilted his head back, letting the breeze cool the heat in his chest. And closed his eyes for a moment. Victory, yes, but not the end. The fight for justice never truly ended. The trial had taken its toll in ways he hadn't anticipated. Within the police department, the air had grown thick with resentment. Officers he'd once shared coffee with now averted their gazes when he passed, their lips pressed into thin lines of disapproval. Whispers followed him down the precinct halls: traitor, turncoat, the man who'd dared to hold one of their own accountable. His role as district attorney, once a source of pride, now felt like a tightrope stretched over a chasm. Even old friendships within law enforcement had frayed, threads snapping under the strain of divided loyalties. But Thomas didn't flinch. He hadn't taken this job to win popularity contests. He'd taken it to uphold a principle: power, unchecked, corrodes everything it touches. Back in his office, the atmosphere was no less strained. The corruption case simmering beneath the surface of Ryan's trial had begun to boil over. What started as a single incident had unraveled into something far uglier: a web of altered reports. Missing files, and officers whose misdeeds had been swept under the rug for years. The evidence they'd unearthed during Ryan's investigation painted a grim picture: a department riddled with rot, protected by silence and fear. Thomas knew there was more work ahead, a mountain of it, but he wasn't ready to charge in recklessly. The trial had taught him the value of precision. Of building a case so ironclad it couldn't be dismantled by clever words or buried by influence. Move too fast, and the whole thing could collapse like a house of cards. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk, his assistant Greg appeared in the doorway. Greg was a wiry man with sharp features and a perpetual air of quiet observation. "Rough day?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, though it didn't quite reach his tired eyes. Thomas nodded, letting his briefcase thud onto the desk. "It's never easy, is it?" he replied, his voice heavy with the day's battles. Greg stepped inside, hands in his pockets. "Never. But you did it, Tom. You got justice for Mayo." Thomas sank into his chair, rubbing his temples where a dull ache had settled. "I did. But there's more coming, Greg. The department's not going to take this lying down. Ryan's conviction, it's a match to dry grass. They'll be watching every step I take now, waiting for me to slip." Greg sighed, dropping into the chair across from him, the leather creaking under his weight. "So, what's next?" Thomas leaned forward, his gaze steady. "We move carefully. We've got enough to go after more of them, names, dates, patterns, but I want it airtight. No cracks, no loopholes. Greg raised an eyebrow, his voice dry. You know that's going to rile up half the department. They're already calling you a traitor behind your back. Thomas met his eyes, unflinching. I didn't sign up to be liked. I signed up to enforce the law. If that makes enemies, so be it. Greg gave a slow, approving nod, leaning back. You're tougher than most, Tom. Thomas's lips curved into a small, weary smile. I don't know about that. I'm just doing what's necessary. Later that evening, Thomas found himself walking the sterile, dimly lit halls of the hospital. The day shift had ended, leaving behind a quiet broken only by the soft beep of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses. He stepped into his mother's room. The faint scent of antiseptic mingling with the flowers someone had left by her bedside. Mayo Clinic was awake, propped up against a stack of pillows. Her eyes bright despite the weariness etched into her face. The bruises that had once marred her skin were fading, a patchwork of yellow and green where purple had once reigned. Her recovery was slow. A fragile thread pulled taut, but it was steady. Hey, Ma, Thomas said softly, pulling a chair close to her bed. She smiled, reaching for his hand with fingers still weak but warm. Hey yourself. How was court? It's done, he said, his voice catching slightly. Ryan's convicted. Mayo's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand, her grip gentle but firm. I knew you'd do the right thing, Tom. He shook his head, staring down at their intertwined hands, the calluses on his palms rough against her fragile skin. It wasn't easy. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a lifetime's wisdom. It never is when you're fighting for what's right. But that's who you are, always have been. You don't bend, no matter how hard the wind blows. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and saw the pride shining there, a beacon in the storm he'd weathered. I learned that from you, he said, his throat tight. Mayo's smile widened. But a shadow of sadness lingered behind it. I wish it hadn't come to this, she murmured. Her eyes drifting to the window where the last streaks of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. Someone in a position of trust, abusing it like that, it's hard to wrap my head around. I spent my life teaching kids to stand tall, to do what's right, and then this happens. Thomas nodded, the ache in his chest deepening. It's hard for me too. But we can't let it stop us. If anything, it's why we keep pushing, for change, for something better. She let out a soft breath, her gaze lingering on the fading light. You're right. And I'm proud of you, Tom. Not just for standing up for me, but for holding the law steady when it would have been easier to look the other way. You didn't make this about vengeance. You made it about justice. Her words hit him like a wave, breaking through the dam he'd built to hold his emotions at bay. He'd kept it together through the trial's chaos, the endless meetings, the press hounding him. The weight of every decision, but hearing her say that cracked something inside him. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed her approval, her quiet strength to anchor him. Thanks, Ma, he whispered. His voice thick. That means everything. They sat in silence for a while, the room bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the city beyond the window settling into night. The burden of the past weeks was still there, pressing against his shoulders, but it felt lighter now. Mayo's slow healing, her unwavering faith in him, it was proof that even after the worst storms, the ground could steady again. I'm going to keep fighting, he said finally, more to himself than to her, his voice resolute. There's so much left to fix, but we'll get there. One step. One case at a time. Mayo's smile was soft, knowing. I know you will. He stood, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, her skin cool against his lips. I'll be back tomorrow. He promised, then turned and stepped into the night air. It was crisp and clear, the stars beginning to prick the dark sky above the sprawling city. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, more battles, more resistance from those who feared the light of accountability, but Thomas felt a fire rekindling in his chest. He'd emerged from this with his principles intact, his belief in justice unbroken. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight, as he stood beneath the vast expanse of stars. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to savor the rare triumph of right prevailing over might. The fluorescent lights in the courthouse lobby hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the nearly deserted space. Their faint buzz was the only sound breaking the stillness, a subtle reminder of the late hour. Judge Alicia Monroe adjusted the strap of her weathered leather briefcase, the weight of it pressing into her shoulder as she moved forward with deliberate, measured steps. Each click of her heels against the polished tile floor echoed with purpose, a rhythm that mirrored the steady beat of her resolve. Today was no ordinary day, it was the culmination of months of tension, a sentencing day for a case that had ignited fierce debates across the nation. The controversy surrounding it had seeped into every corner of her life, from the courtroom to the quiet moments at home, and now, as she approached the security checkpoint, she carried the weight of that scrutiny with her. Ahead, Officer Daniels loomed like a storm cloud against the metal detector. His broad shoulders filled out his crisp blue uniform. The fabric starched to perfection, and his light blue eyes tracked her every movement with a cold, judgmental glint. Leaning casually against the machine, his posture exuded an arrogance that made the air around him feel heavier. Alicia had crossed paths with him before, brief encounters that always left a sour taste in her mouth, his condescension lingering like a shadow. But today, there was something sharper in his demeanor, a jagged edge to his usual smugness that set her instincts on high alert. She straightened her spine, her dark eyes narrowing slightly as she closed the distance between them. "ID," Daniels barked, his voice slicing through the quiet like a blade. The word was clipped, harsh, and carried just enough venom to make her pause. Alicia raised an eyebrow, her expression unflinching as she met his gaze. "Good morning to you too, Officer Daniels," she replied. Her tone smooth and measured, laced with a quiet defiance. Reaching into her briefcase, she retrieved her government-issued badge, her fingers brushing against the cool metal before she extended it toward him. Daniels snatched it from her hand with a roughness that bordered on disrespect, holding it up to the light as if it were some cheap trinket he suspected she'd bought off the street. He squinted at it, his lips curling into a smirk that dripped with mockery. "Judge, huh?" he drawled, his voice thick with skepticism. "You don't look like a judge." The air in the lobby seemed to freeze, the hum of the lights growing louder in the silence that followed. Alicia's gaze locked onto his, steady and unyielding, her dark eyes boring into him like a spotlight exposing every crack in his bravado. "And what exactly does a judge look like, officer?" she asked. Her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel, the kind of authority that didn't need to shout to be felt. Daniels ignored her question, his smirk stretching wider as he waved a hand dismissively. "Step aside. I need to run a secondary check on you." His tone was flippant, as if he were swatting away a minor annoyance. But the command hung heavy between them. Alicia didn't flinch. Her expression remained a mask of composure, though beneath it, a flicker of indignation sparked to life. The other officers stationed nearby, two younger men with nervous eyes and stiff postures, exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering near their belts as if unsure whether to step in. Daniels, either oblivious or indifferent to their discomfort, gestured toward a small screening area off to the side, his movements impatient and exaggerated. This wasn't the first time Alicia had faced prejudice in her career, the subtle jabs and outright disrespect that came with being a woman of color in a position of power. But as she stepped aside, her mind was already racing, years of legal training weaving together a plan. This wasn't just a petty power play, it was a moment that demanded more than patience. It required brilliance. And she intended to deliver. With her head held high, Alicia moved into the screening area, her heels striking the floor with a sharp, deliberate cadence. Each sound was a quiet rebellion. A reminder of the authority Daniels seemed determined to strip from her. He followed close behind, his boots thudding against the tiles. His presence invasive as he positioned himself just a step too near. Crossing his arms over his chest, he loomed over her, that same condescending smirk plastered across his face. "You know," he began, his voice low and dripping with disdain, "we get a lot of people coming through here claiming to be someone important. Can't trust everything you see on a badge." His words were a taunt. A thinly veiled accusation meant to rattle her. Alicia tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a witness on the stand whose story was unraveling under cross-examination. "And what would you suggest I do to prove myself, Officer Daniels?" she asked, her tone steady and precise. "Wear a robe and carry a gavel at all times?" Her words were laced with a dry humor that didn't reach her eyes, a subtle jab at his absurdity. Daniels chuckled, but the sound was hollow, devoid of warmth. A patronizing echo that bounced off the tiled walls. "Funny," he said, leaning in just enough to make the space feel smaller. "But no, Judge, I think you'll need to answer a few questions." "Questions?" Alicia repeated, her voice as even as the ticking of a metronome, though her mind churned with a mix of frustration and calculation. "On what grounds?" Daniels shrugged. His smirk unshaken, as if the answer were irrelevant. "Just procedure," he said, his tone casual but barbed. "You don't seem like the type who'd understand the gravity of the law. What are you? Early 40s? Got lucky, pulled a few strings?" The insinuation landed like a slap, his words painting her as an imposter. Someone who'd stumbled into her position rather than earned it through years of relentless work. Alicia felt a surge of anger ripple through her. A hot flare that threatened to crack her calm exterior. But she tamped it down, her discipline forged through decades of facing worse, skeptical juries, dismissive colleagues, outright hostility. Instead, she let a small, composed smile curve her lips, the kind that promised she was already 3 steps ahead. "I see," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "So my years of legal education. My tenure on the bench, the rulings I've made in cases that shaped lives, all of that means nothing because you've decided to play gatekeeper today." Her words were a mirror. Reflecting his overreach back at him, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Daniels leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, lady. I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. You want to keep arguing, or do you want to get this over with?" Behind him, the other officers stood in silence. Their eyes darting between the two like spectators at a standoff. The younger of the two, a wiry man with a freckled face, shifted his weight, his fingers twitching nervously near his radio. The older one, graying at the temples, kept his gaze fixed on the floor, as if pretending he wasn't witnessing the scene unfold. Alicia reached into her bag once more, producing her ID with a slow, deliberate grace. "Here's what's going to happen, Officer Daniels," she said, her voice a quiet command. "You're going to scan my badge, verify it, and let me through. Then you can return to your actual job instead of targeting me for reasons we both know have nothing to do with security." Daniels blinked, caught off guard by the steel in her tone. But his smirk quickly snapped back into place. "We'll see about that," he muttered, snatching the badge again. He held it up to the light, turning it over with exaggerated scrutiny. As if he might uncover some hidden flaw. Alicia stood motionless, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the fire simmering within her. He was trying to provoke her. To push her into a reaction he could twist against her, but she wasn't just any woman, he was about to discover that the hard way. Daniels dragged out the inspection, flipping the badge over and squinting at its edges as if it held secrets only he could decipher. His performance was blatant, a clumsy attempt to assert dominance. To shrink her down to something he could control. He grunted, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Doesn't look official to me. You sure you didn't pick this up online? Alicia's eyebrow arched, her gaze slicing through him like a blade. Perhaps if you spent more time studying government credentials and less time harassing citizens, you'd recognize an official badge when you saw one, she replied, her voice cool and precise, each word a measured strike. A few of the nearby officers stifled smirks. Their discomfort with Daniel's antics palpable, though none dared to speak up. The freckled one coughed into his fist, his eyes darting away, while the older one rubbed the back of his neck, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Daniels, however, was undeterred. He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a sneer. You've got a smart mouth for someone standing in my courthouse, he said. His words laced with possession, as if the building were his personal kingdom. Alicia's eyes narrowed, a subtle shift that sharpened her presence. Your courthouse, she echoed. Her voice low but resonant. Last I checked, this building belongs to the taxpayers, and I happen to be one of them. Daniel's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. For a moment, he looked as though he might snap, his bravado teetering on the edge. But instead, he reached for his radio, clicking it on with a flourish that screamed theatrics. I'm going to need verification on a questionable ID, he announced, his voice booming through the lobby, drawing the attention of a lone clerk shuffling papers at the far end of the room. The tension thickened, a tangible weight pressing down on the space. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing as the situation spiraled. Alicia, however, stood like a pillar. Her posture impeccable, her commanding aura filling the room. Questionable ID, she repeated, her voice slicing through his bluster with surgical precision. Officer Daniels. Do you honestly believe this little show is going unnoticed? His smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, but he quickly masked it, turning his attention to the radio. Just following protocol, ma'am. He said, the word ma'am dripping with mockery. Alicia let the silence stretch, her gaze never wavering from his. The other officers fidgeted. The younger one glancing at his partner as if pleading for rescue, while the older one stared at a spot on the wall, his face a mask of resignation. Finally, she spoke. Her tone as sharp as a judge's gavel. If your protocol includes harassing officers of the court, perhaps you should reconsider it. Or better yet, I'll review it for you when I'm back on the bench. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, a promise woven into her words that made Daniel's smirk waver again. For the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed his face, he might have underestimated her. And the realization stung. But instead of retreating, he doubled down, leaning in with a bravado that felt more desperate than confident. You don't intimidate me, he said, his voice low and rough. Alicia's smile widened, but it wasn't one of amusement, it was the smile of a strategist who'd already claimed victory in a game her opponent didn't even know he'd lost. Good, she replied. Her voice smooth and unwavering, because this isn't about intimidation. It's about accountability. Daniel stood rigid, clinging to his crumbling facade as he spoke into the radio, relaying the so-called suspicious ID with a forced authority. Alicia watched him in silence, her presence a quiet storm that seemed to unnerve him more with every passing second. I'm going to need you to stay right here while I wait for confirmation, he said, gesturing toward a nearby bench with a dismissive flick of his hand. Alicia glanced at the bench, a chipped, utilitarian thing bolted to the floor, then back at Daniels. And what exactly do you suspect me of, officer? She asked, her voice steady and clear. I'd like to hear you say it, for the record. He faltered, his confidence cracking for a moment before he masked it with a scoff. Just routine security, he snapped. You're acting awfully defensive for someone with nothing to hide. Alicia tilted her head, her tone laced with a subtle incredulity that cut deeper than any shout. Routine security, she echoed. Fascinating. Given that you've let 3 other individuals pass through without so much as a glance at their IDs. Daniel stiffened, his face flushing slightly. But he refused to acknowledge the truth in her observation. I'm just doing my job, he barked, his voice rising with frustration. And I'm doing mine, Alicia replied. Her words smooth as silk yet heavy with implication. Though I find it curious that your version of routine involves targeting those who don't fit your narrow vision of authority. The air hung thick with her accusation, and Daniel's arrogance faltered, his flush deepening. But he pressed on, unwilling to yield. Listen, ma'am, he said, his tone sharp, you can keep talking. But it won't change the fact that I call the shots here. Alicia let his words linger, studying him like a chess master sizing up a reckless opponent. Then, with a calm that belied the fire within her, she spoke. If you're so certain of your authority, why not escalate this further? Call your supervisor. Her voice was steady, edged with a challenge that made Daniels hesitate. His smirk faded, just for a moment, and in that fleeting crack, she saw it, the first hint of fear. This wasn't just a standoff. It was a lesson in justice, a stark reminder that power, when abused, carried consequences. And Alicia Monroe was more than ready to see it through. The suggestion of involving his superior hit Officer Daniels like a cold gust of wind, an unexpected twist that sent a shiver of unease rippling through him. He hadn't seen it coming. And now the stakes felt higher than he'd ever intended. That's not necessary, he shot back, his voice quick and clipped, as if speed could bury the tremor of doubt creeping into his chest. I've got this under control. His words carried the bravado he clung to like a lifeline, but beneath them, his mind churned. Had he overplayed his hand? Alicia, standing poised across from him, let a faint smile curl her lips. It wasn't a warm smile, nor one of triumph just yet, but a quiet glimmer of satisfaction danced in her dark eyes. She tilted her head slightly, sizing him up. Oh. I'm sure you do, Officer Daniels, she replied, her tone smooth as polished stone, each word deliberate. But here's the thing, you've stepped beyond control. You've waded into the murky waters of abusing your authority, and I'd wager your supervisors would find this little exchange just as fascinating as I do. Her voice didn't waver. But there was a spark in it now, a flicker of something sharp and unrelenting that made the air between them feel heavier. Daniels opened his mouth, his jaw tightening as if ready to fire back. But Alicia wasn't about to let him reclaim the moment. With a calm, almost theatrical grace, she reached into her sleek leather briefcase. Her fingers brushing past folders and papers until they closed around a small, glossy device. She pulled it out, a slender, modern recorder. Its surface catching the dim light of the courthouse security checkpoint. She pressed a button with a soft click, and a faint beep pierced the silence, followed by a robotic voice, * recording saved. * The sound hung in the air like a gavel's echo, and the other officers stationed nearby froze, their eyes widening in unison. One shifted his weight, his boots squeaking faintly against the tiled floor. Another blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what had just shifted in the room. Daniel's face drained of color. The smug confidence he'd worn like armor dissolving into something pale and fragile. His breath caught for a split second, and Alicia noticed. Oh, she noticed everything. She held the recorder aloft. Its presence a silent accusation glowing brighter than any spotlight. You see, she continued, her voice steady and unrushed, I've learned to document moments like these. Accountability. Officer Daniels, it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? So why don't we take a moment, you and I, and listen to this together? We can decide if your actions today align with the fine print of your department's policies. Her words were a blade, precise and unrelenting, cutting through the arrogance he'd built his stance on. The smirk that had once defined Daniel's expression was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace that barely concealed the storm brewing inside him. His mind raced, he could feel it in the way his eyes flickered, the way his shoulders tensed as if bracing for a blow. He'd underestimated her. And the realization crashed over him like a wave he couldn't outrun. Alicia, though, wasn't finished peeling back the layers of his facade. The recorder in her hand seemed to pulse with a quiet power, illuminating every crack in the authority he'd wielded so carelessly. Now, she said, her tone as smooth as ever, while we wait for this so-called verification you've insisted on. Let's unpack what's happened here. You've detained me without a shred of cause, subjected me to scrutiny I didn't ask for, and, quite directly, I might add, suggested I don't look like someone who could hold the position I do. Should I keep going? Daniels crossed his arms, the gesture tight and defensive, his fingers digging into his sleeves. His gaze darted toward the other officers, a silent plea for backup flashing in his eyes. But they didn't move. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, wrapping around him like a noose. One officer, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his jaw, shifted his stance, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Another, an older man with a weathered badge pinned to his chest, stood still, his face a mask of quiet observation. Daniels swallowed hard. I told you, he began, his voice rough with defiance. This is just protocol. Protocol, Alicia repeated, letting the word roll off her tongue as if tasting it. Her tone was almost conversational now, but there was a glint of steel beneath it. Well then, you won't mind if we double-check that your actions match up with this protocol of yours, will you? I'd hate for there to be any confusion when this recording gets a thorough review, say, by Internal Affairs. Or maybe even the press. Daniel's face flushed a deeper shade of red, his jaw clenching so hard she could almost hear the grind of his teeth. You're making a big deal out of nothing, he snapped, his voice cracking at the edges. Alicia's eyebrows lifted, a faint shadow of disbelief breaking through her composed exterior. Nothing? She echoed, her voice rising just enough to carry the weight of her incredulity. Let me paint you a picture of nothing, Officer Daniels. Nothing is me walking through those courthouse doors, where I've presided over more cases than I can count, to do my job without being stopped and questioned like some stranger off the street. Nothing is being treated with the same dignity my colleagues receive every day. This? She gestured subtly toward the empty security checkpoint, where no one else had been flagged. Her hand slicing through the air with quiet precision. This is something. Something you're going to have to answer for. Daniels opened his mouth again, his lips parting as if he could argue his way out, but Alicia raised a hand, a simple, commanding motion that stopped him cold. Her palm hovered there, steady and unyielding, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. But maybe I'm being unfair, she said, her tone shifting, now cool and almost clinical, like a professor dissecting a problem. Maybe you didn't know who I was. Maybe you were just blissfully unaware of my role here. Let me clear that up for you. She straightened, her posture radiating authority, her voice gaining an edge that cut through the tension like a knife. I am Judge Alicia Monroe, appointed by the governor of this state, confirmed by the Senate, and currently presiding over the most high-profile case this jurisdiction has seen in years. I'm not here to bicker with you, Officer Daniels. I'm here to do my job. Daniels took a step back. An involuntary retreat as his bravado faltered. His eyes flickered with something raw, panic, perhaps, or the dawning weight of his misstep. I didn't mean, he started, but Alicia cut him off. her voice sharpening like a blade drawn from its sheath. "No, Officer Daniels, you meant every word you said. But here's where we differ. I don't need to justify myself to you or anyone else in this room. You, on the other hand, will need to explain this officially." The tension crackled, a live wire ready to spark. The other officers, who had been silent statues until now, exchanged uneasy glances. The younger one rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers trembling slightly. The older one, his badge glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights, stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. "Judge Monroe," the older officer said, his voice cautious. Weathered by years of navigating moments like this. His gray eyes met hers, steady but tinged with unease. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Alicia turned to him. Her expression softening just a fraction, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her steel resolve. "Yes, actually," she replied, her tone measured. "Could you tell me if this prolonged inspection is standard procedure for members of the judiciary entering this courthouse?" The older officer hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. He glanced at Daniels, then back at Alicia, caught between loyalty and the truth staring him in the face. Finally, he sighed, a quiet sound of resignation. "No, ma'am," he admitted. His voice low but clear. "It's not." Daniels shot him a glare, his eyes blazing with betrayal, but the older man didn't flinch. The damage was done, and Alicia's faint smile returned, cool, controlled. And edged with something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought as much," she said softly. "Thank you for clearing that up." The air shifted, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Daniel's authority, once propped up by arrogance, teetered on the edge of collapse. Alicia watched him, her gaze steady and piercing, cutting deeper than any accusation could. The older officer stepped back, his face unreadable, though his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't about to dig Daniel's hole any deeper. But Daniels wasn't ready to surrender. His pride, battered but stubborn, pushed him forward. "Look," he said, his voice wavering despite his effort to steady it, "I don't need to explain myself to you. I was just doing my job. If you don't like it, take it up with someone else." "Oh, I will," Alicia replied, her words smooth as silk but laced with an edge that promised consequences. "But let's not rush ahead. I want to make sure this protocol of yours is documented down to the last detail. After all, you're just doing your job, right? I'm sure you'd love for your superiors to see how committed you are to security." Her sarcasm was a quiet weapon, each syllable tightening the knot around Daniel's crumbling defense. She took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the tile, her presence commanding the room without effort. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her voice low but firm, resonating with an authority that filled the space. "You're going to hand me back my ID. Then you're going to apologize for wasting my time and making baseless assumptions about who I am. And finally, you're going to explain to your supervisor why this escalated, because I'll be filing a formal complaint the second I walk away from here." Daniel's face flushed a deep crimson. His smirk a distant memory, replaced by a strained mask of panic and defiance. "That's not necessary," he muttered, his voice crumbling like dry earth underfoot. "Oh, but it is," Alicia countered, her tone unwavering. "You see, I'm not just any judge. I'm a judge who believes in accountability. When people in power abuse their authority, they don't just answer to me, they answer to the law itself." A murmur rippled through the small cluster of officers who had gathered near the checkpoint, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The younger one shifted again, his eyes darting between Alicia and Daniels, as if weighing whose side history would favor. The older officer stepped forward once more, this time placing a firm hand on Daniels' shoulder. "Daniels," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience, give her the badge back. Daniels hesitated. His hand twitching as if reluctant to let go of the last shred of control he'd clung to. His chest rose and fell with a sharp, frustrated breath, and then, with a stiff jerk, he extended Alicia's badge toward her. "Here," he said curtly, the word clipped and bitter. Alicia accepted it with deliberate care, her fingers brushing the smooth surface as if reclaiming something sacred. "Thank you," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes locked on his, unyielding. "Now, the apology." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin, trembling line, his pride warring with the pressure bearing down on him. He looked like the words might choke him. But the weight of the moment, and the eyes of his colleagues, left him no escape. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible, a whisper swallowed by the room's tension. Alicia tilted her head, her expression calm but expectant. "Louder, please. I want everyone here to hear it." Daniel's cheeks burned a deeper red, his fists clenching at his sides as if anchoring himself against the humiliation. "I'm sorry," he repeated, louder this time, the words ringing out with a hollow edge. "Apology accepted," Alicia said coolly, her voice cutting through the awkward silence that followed. "But this isn't over." Daniel's apology lingered like a sour note, his jaw clenched tight, his posture rigid with the sting of defeat. Alicia didn't revel in it, she didn't need to. The room was hers now, the power dynamics flipped on their head, and she held it with a quiet, unshakable grace. Slipping her badge into her briefcase with precise, deliberate movements, she spoke again. "Let's address the final piece of this mess. Your actions today are a glaring reminder of the flaws we fight to root out in public service: bias, discrimination, abuse of power. As a judge, I hold officers of the law to the highest standard. I expect nothing less from you." Daniels opened his mouth, a retort forming, but before he could speak, the older officer cut in, his voice firm and final. "That's enough, Daniels. Step back." Daniels shot him a glare, his eyes blazing with frustration, but the older man's authority held firm. With a sharp, angry breath, Daniels retreated, his shoulders stiff with barely contained fury. Alicia turned to the older officer, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you for his intervention. "I appreciate you stepping in," she said. "I trust you'll make sure this incident is properly documented?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his tone respectful, his gray eyes steady. "I'll handle it personally." "Good," Alicia said, her voice firm. "And I'll be following up to ensure it's done." She shifted her gaze back to Daniels, who was now avoiding her eyes, his head turned slightly as if he could escape her scrutiny. "Officer Daniels," she said, her words measured but heavy with meaning, "consider this a lesson. The next time you're tempted to question someone's place, ask yourself if your actions stem from protocol or prejudice. Because I promise you, the law won't look the other way." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone like dust after a storm. Daniels stood there, diminished, his arrogance stripped bare by the consequences he'd invited. The older officer watched her with a quiet respect, his years of service lending him the wisdom to recognize justice when he saw it. The younger officer fidgeted, his nervous energy a stark contrast to the stillness around him. And Alicia, Judge Alicia Monroe, stood tall, her presence a testament to the power of accountability. A reminder that authority misused would always find its reckoning. The air in the courthouse felt heavy that morning, thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint hum of anticipation. Daniel stood off to the side, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't say a word. But the tightness in his jaw and the way his hands clenched into fists at his side screamed louder than any outburst could have. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority, seemed to hang on him like a ill-fitting costume, betraying the storm of emotions roiling beneath his stern exterior: embarrassment, frustration, maybe even a flicker of regret. He avoided looking at anyone directly, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance, as if he could will himself out of this moment. Alicia, meanwhile, stood poised near the security checkpoint, her fingers brushing against the worn leather strap of her briefcase as she adjusted it with a practiced motion. Her movements were deliberate, calm. A stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. She turned her head slightly, her sharp eyes scanning the bustling corridor ahead, ready to move forward and leave the incident behind her. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across the marble floor, illuminating the path she was about to take. But before she could take more than a step, a voice pierced the air, halting her in her tracks. "Judge Monroe," it called, urgent and laced with worry. She turned to see a young court clerk jogging toward her. His lanky frame awkward in his haste. His name was Ethan, she recalled, a nervous but earnest kid, barely out of his 20s. With wide eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair that always seemed to fall into his face. Today, those eyes were clouded with concern. His brow furrowed as he clutched a clipboard to his chest like a shield. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "We heard there was some kind of commotion at security." His gaze darted briefly to Daniel, lingering there with a mix of curiosity and unease, before snapping back to Alicia. Alicia offered him a small, reassuring smile. The kind that carried warmth but left no room for doubt about her control of the situation. "Everything's fine now, Ethan," she said smoothly, her tone steady as granite. "Just a minor hiccup at the checkpoint, nothing more." She watched as Ethan nodded, though his shoulders didn't fully relax. His eyes flicked back to Daniel again, who now stood rigid in the corner like a statue, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions, red with humiliation one moment, dark with anger the next. "If there's anything I can do," Ethan began. His voice trailing off, unsure how to finish the offer. "Thank you," Alicia cut in gently, her words firm but kind, "but I've got it handled." She turned then, her heel striking the polished floor with a crisp, confident rhythm that echoed through the corridor. As she walked, she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of whispers rippling through the courthouse staff around her. Heads turned subtly, eyes followed her, and hushed voices traded fragments of the story. Word of Daniel's outburst was spreading like wildfire, and she knew it wouldn't stay contained. His humiliation was no longer a private matter, it was becoming a public lesson. One that would cling to him like a shadow. Just before she reached the towering double doors of the courtroom, Alicia paused. She turned her head, her dark hair catching the light as she cast one final glance back at Daniel. Their eyes locked for a fleeting second, and in that brief exchange, she thought she saw something shift in his expression, a crack in his armor, perhaps. Was it shame? The faint stirrings of self-awareness? She couldn't be sure, and truthfully, it didn't matter. She wasn't here to mend his broken pride or guide him toward redemption. Her purpose was bigger, sharper, unwavering. She was here to uphold justice. To wield it like a blade against those who abused their power. With that thought steady in her mind, she pushed through the doors and stepped into the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with a different kind of energy. The room was packed, reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, attorneys shuffled papers and exchanged low murmurs. And spectators craned their necks from the gallery, eager for a front-row seat to the high-profile sentencing Alicia was about to oversee. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of their anticipation, and the air thrummed with the gravity of what was to come. She ascended the bench, her black robe settling around her like a mantle of authority, and took her seat with the quiet dignity of someone who knew the power she held. She adjusted the folds of her robe, her hands steady, her face an unreadable mask of resolve. The earlier incident at security might as well have been a distant memory, she gave it no space here. The gavel came down, and the proceedings began. Her voice cutting through the room with precision and command. But outside those walls, the ripples of her confrontation with Daniel were already swelling into waves. By mid-morning, the courthouse buzzed with gossip. Staff members who'd witnessed the scene replayed it in vivid detail over coffee breaks and in quiet corners, the way Daniel had barked orders. His voice dripping with arrogance, the way Alicia had stood her ground, unshaken, her calm demeanor dismantling his bluster without raising her tone. The story grew with each retelling, painting Daniel as a cautionary tale of unchecked bias and Alicia as a pillar of unyielding fairness. It wasn't just idle chatter, it was a reckoning, a reminder that actions carried weight. And power, when misused, could crumble under its own excess. By midday, the head of courthouse security, Captain Morales, sought her out. He was a stout man with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent navigating tense situations. He knocked on the door to her chambers, his expression a mix of resolve and unease as he stepped inside. "Judge Monroe," he began, his deep voice tinged with a heaviness that matched the lines etched into his forehead. "I need to apologize personally for what happened this morning. Officer Daniel's behavior was out of line, completely unacceptable. It's not what we stand for here." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the arms, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "I appreciate that, Captain," she replied, her voice cool but edged with steel. "But words alone don't fix this. This isn't the first time I've faced prejudice from someone in his role, and I'd be naive to think it'll be the last. What I want, what I expect, is accountability." She watched Morales closely, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers flexed slightly at his sides. He wasn't defensive, but he carried the weight of this failure personally. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet determination. "I understand. Daniel's been pulled from his post for now, pending a full internal review. We're not sweeping this under the rug, I promise you that." His words were firm, but there was a trace of weariness in them, as if he, too, knew how deep these roots ran. Alicia leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the desk now, her voice dropping to a measured, deliberate cadence. "Good. Because this isn't just about me, Captain. It's about every person who walks through those doors, every defendant, every lawyer, every citizen, deserving respect, no matter who they are. If we let this slide, we're not just failing me. We're failing them." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, a call to something greater than personal vindication. Morales assured her the review would be thorough. But Alicia made it clear she wouldn't let it end there. She'd be watching, ready to push further if the system faltered. She wasn't naive, she knew justice didn't come easily. And power didn't yield without a fight. But she was relentless, and that was her strength. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the courthouse grew quiet, Alicia stepped out into the parking lot. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and asphalt, and the dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. She was almost to her car when she noticed him, Daniel, lingering near his squad car, his posture stiff and uncertain. He looked smaller now, stripped of the bravado that had fueled him earlier. "Judge Monroe," he called out, his voice rough with hesitation, barely loud enough to reach her. She stopped, turning to face him, her expression a blank slate. "Yes, Officer Daniel," she asked, her tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made him shift uncomfortably. He struggled for a moment, his hands fidgeting at his sides, his eyes darting to the ground and back to her. Finally, he drew a shaky breath. I wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. I was wrong. Way out of line." His words stumbled out, raw and unpolished, and she could see the conflict etched into his face, pride warring with the weight of his mistake. Alicia studied him. Her gaze unwavering, taking in every flicker of emotion. "You were," she said simply, her bluntness cutting through the space between them. "But an apology's only the beginning. What matters is what comes next, how you change, what you do with this." There was no softness in her voice, no absolution, but no malice either. It was a challenge, a mirror held up to him. Daniel nodded, his head dipping as he stared at the ground. "I'll do better," he muttered, the words quiet but heavy, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "We'll see," Alicia replied. Her tone even, leaving the outcome in his hands. She turned then, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked to her car, leaving him standing alone under the flickering lights. As she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, a quiet satisfaction settled over her. She knew change, real, systemic change, was a long, grueling road, paved with resistance and setbacks. But moments like this, where accountability took root and justice flexed its muscle, were victories worth savoring. Daniel had been forced to confront a hard truth that day. Power without restraint was a fragile thing, easily shattered when it met someone unwilling to bend. And Alicia? She was just getting started. For every Daniel she crossed paths with, there were countless others out there, arrogant, biased, careless, waiting to be challenged. She'd face them all, one by one, with the same steady resolve. Knowing that each encounter was a step toward something bigger. Justice wasn't just a concept to her, it was a living, breathing force, and she'd wield it as long as she had breath to fight. On a bustling afternoon in Atlanta, the sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement where Officer Daniels stood, his uniform crisp but his posture rigid with unease. The faint hum of traffic blended with the growing murmur of a crowd that had begun to gather, their eyes sharp with curiosity and suspicion. Daniels's face, once flushed with the confidence of authority, drained of color as Marcus, a tall figure in a tailored suit, lifted a file from his briefcase with the deliberate grace of a victor hoisting a hard-won prize. "Recognize this?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth yet piercing, cutting through the thickening tension like a blade honed for precision. Daniels blinked rapidly, his composure faltering, caught utterly unprepared. He stood silent, lips pressed tight. As the whispers from the onlookers swelled, a wildfire of doubt and intrigue spreading through the air. Marcus let the moment hang, savoring the shift in power. "Let's just say," he continued, his tone brimming with a quiet, unshakable certainty, "I know this department inside and out. And I'd wager internal affairs would find your behavior today very compelling." Daniels's jaw clenched. The bravado he'd worn like armor beginning to crack under the weight of Marcus's words. His eyes darted briefly to the crowd, then back to Marcus, defiance flickering but not yet extinguished. "I'm doing my job," he snapped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his unraveling confidence. Marcus exhaled slowly. A deliberate sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a man who'd seen this dance before. He snapped his briefcase shut with a soft, final click and locked eyes with the officer. "Oh, officer," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steely register, "you just stepped into something you can't walk away from." The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs rising into a chorus of anticipation. The air heavy with the promise of a storm about to break. Marcus stood unwavering, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Daniels's mounting agitation. The officer's face twisted into a sneer, his voice slicing through the noise. "You talk a big game," he spat, "but out here, I'm the law. You're just another suspect who thinks he's too smart to answer questions." Marcus tilted his head, a faint chuckle escaping his lips, not out of fear, but amusement, as if Daniels's bluster were a child's tantrum. "Is that right?" he replied, his tone light but edged with steel. "Because from where I stand, you look more like a man playing sheriff than upholding justice." Daniels's hand tightened around the baton at his hip, his knuckles whitening as his temper flared. "Watch yourself," he growled, stepping closer, his breath hot with frustration. "You're on thin ice." Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he took a single, measured step forward. Narrowing the gap just enough to make his presence undeniable, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Thin ice, officer. I'm standing on a foundation of facts and law. You, though, you're the one teetering on the edge of abusing your power." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, their fascination now tinged with awe at Marcus's unflinching resolve. Daniel's eyes widened, his bravado wavering, but his pride wouldn't let him yield, not yet, not with so many watching. "You think that fancy suit and slick talk make you untouchable?" Daniel shot back, his voice rising as he shifted tactics. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The crowd erupted in protest, voices overlapping in a swell of indignation. But Marcus raised a hand, silencing them with a gesture as steady as his gaze. He didn't look afraid, if anything, a spark of intrigue danced in his eyes. As though this confrontation were a riddle he was on the cusp of unraveling. "Arresting me now, are you?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual but laced with a razor-sharp point. "And what's the charge? Walking while black? Carrying a briefcase with ambition? Or maybe just existing where you don't think I belong?" Daniels froze, his gaze flickering to the crowd. The whispers had turned to accusations, words like racist and abuse threading through the air, carried on the wind of their growing unrest. Marcus seized the moment. His voice rising just enough to ensure every ear caught his words. "You see, Officer Daniels, you might think that badge lets you act without consequence. But in this city, accountability is my trade, and I'm damn good at it." With a flourish, he reached into his suit jacket, pulling out a crisp document. He unfolded it slowly, letting the tension build. Then held it out for Daniels to see. A subpoena, with the officer's name emblazoned across the top in bold, unyielding letters. "This," Marcus declared, his voice steady as stone, "is for a case I'm working on, systemic racial profiling in your precinct. I was headed to the courthouse with evidence. Looks like you just gave me a live exhibit." The crowd exploded. A chaotic symphony of laughter, cheers, and outrage, phones raised high to capture the unraveling drama. Daniel stood rooted, his face a storm of fury, confusion, and dawning fear. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the shift, his authority, once ironclad, now slipping through his fingers like sand. Marcus leaned in. His voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Daniels. "You wanted to peek inside my bag? It's packed with receipts, officer, proof you can't dodge." The crowd's cheers grew louder. Emboldened by Marcus's quiet fury, but Daniels wasn't ready to surrender. Not here, not with the world watching. He straightened, gripping his baton tighter, his voice strained but defiant. "I'm giving you one last chance to comply, or this gets official." Marcus smirked, a tempest brewing behind his calm exterior. "By all means, make it official." The air crackled with anticipation. The crowd sensing the tipping point of a clash that could define more than just this moment. Daniel's knuckles gleamed white around his baton, his grip a desperate anchor as his power crumbled. The murmurs turned to shouts, voices rising in a cacophony of support for Marcus and mockery for the officer. "You gonna let him talk to you like that?" someone jeered from the back. The taunt dripping with disdain, not for Marcus, but for Daniels, whose once towering confidence now seemed frail as tissue paper. "I said hands behind your back," Daniels barked, his voice cracking with desperation. Marcus remained still, his expression a mask of serene defiance. He took a slow, deep breath, then spoke, his words measured and cutting. "Officer Daniels, here's some free advice. When someone warns you you're digging a hole, stop handing them the shovel. Laughter erupted again, a wave that seemed to physically push Daniels back. His face contorted. Frustration boiling over as he closed the gap, looming inches from Marcus. "You think this is a joke?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Let's see how funny it is when you're locked up." Marcus tilted his head, meeting Daniels's glare with an unshakable calm. "I'm not laughing, officer. But I'll admit, this is intriguing. A black lawyer wrongfully detained by a cop already under fire for bias? The story writes itself." Daniels's resolve flickered, doubt creeping into his eyes, but his ego held firm. "You match a description," he insisted, grasping for control. "That's why I stopped you." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice lifting to carry over the crowd. "And what's that description? Male, black, with a briefcase?" "Bravo, officer, you've just profiled half the black professionals in Atlanta." The crowd roared again, some clapping, others shouting in solidarity, their voices a rising tide. Daniels's face flushed crimson, a mix of rage and humiliation, but he couldn't stop now. He reached for his radio, fingers trembling as he prepared to call for backup. Marcus raised a hand, his tone sharp enough to halt him mid-motion. "Before you do that, you might want to check with your supervisor. Because if you push these videos," he gestured to the sea of phones aimed at them, "will go far beyond your precinct. This won't just cost you your badge, it'll cost your department its credibility. And trust me, I excel at holding people accountable." Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering over the radio, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. The crowd's murmurs swelled into a roar of disbelief and approval, their collective gaze a mirror reflecting his faltering authority. Marcus stood firm, his voice quiet but resolute. "Your move, officer." Daniels glanced around, at the phones, the faces, the unyielding figure before him. For the first time, uncertainty shadowed his eyes. His pride wrestling with the dawning realization of his misstep. The air hung heavy with the unspoken question, would he double down, or back away? In that tense pause, the lesson loomed large: justice wasn't a privilege to be wielded carelessly, and power, when abused, carried a steep price. Marcus knew it, the crowd felt it, and Daniels, whether he admitted it or not, was beginning to sense the consequences closing in. The street, once just a backdrop, now stood as a stage where accountability demanded its due. And the echoes of this encounter would ripple far beyond the moment, a stark reminder that no badge could shield a man from the truth. The air buzzed with a restless hum as the crowd's murmurs swelled into a tempest of whispers, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The tension was palpable. A heavy fog that seemed to press down on everyone present, stifling breaths and tightening throats. Marcus stood at the center of it all, his words lingering like echoes in a canyon. Each syllable slicing through the brittle facade of authority that Officer Daniels clung to. The officer's hand hovered over his radio, fingers twitching with uncertainty. His face a battlefield where pride and doubt waged a silent war. His blue eyes flickered, caught in a storm of his own making, as he weighed his next move under the unrelenting gaze of dozens. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His very presence carried the gravity of a man who had seen too much. Who knew too much, truths that hung unspoken yet deafening in the charged air between them. "Officer Daniels," he began, his voice steady as a judge's gavel, yet laced with a quiet power that demanded attention, "I'd advise you to think long and hard about what you do next. This isn't just about you and me anymore. This moment, it's bigger. It's you against the law, the press, and the unrelenting tide of public judgment. And let's be real here, you don't look like you're equipped to weather that kind of storm." The crowd erupted then. A burst of scattered cheers and applause breaking through the tension like sunlight piercing clouds. Emboldened by Marcus's unwavering stance, a few voices rose above the din, "Yeah, leave him alone. And we're all watching." Their shouts sharp and defiant. Cell phones gleamed in the afternoon light, lenses trained on Daniels like the unyielding eyes of a jury that refused to blink. The officer's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his skin as he stole a glance at the growing sea of faces around him. The swagger he'd carried when he first approached Marcus, chest puffed, voice brimming with bravado, began to erode, crumbling under the weight of those watchful eyes. He turned back to Marcus, his glare narrowing into something fierce yet brittle. "This isn't over." Daniels growled, though the fire in his words had dulled, replaced by a hollow edge that betrayed his faltering confidence. Marcus arched an eyebrow, his expression unruffled, almost amused. "Oh. I'm well aware it's not over," he replied, his tone smooth as polished stone. "In fact, I'll make sure it's not. You've just tossed a match into a fire that's already roaring hotter than you can handle, officer. And trust me, it's only going to spread." Daniels's hand drifted from his radio, his fingers loosening their grip on the baton at his side. He wasn't ready to back down, not entirely, but the cracks in his resolve were widening. "You're awfully smug for someone I could haul off in cuffs right now," he snapped, though the sharpness in his voice had softened, dulled by the reality creeping in. Marcus smirked, taking a deliberate step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried to the eager ears of the crowd. "And you're awfully bold for someone who just got caught red-handed in crystal clear 4K by at least 20 witnesses." Laughter rippled through the onlookers, some hearty and unrestrained, others tinged with nervous energy. Daniels's face flushed a deep crimson, the kind of shame that painted itself across his features with no hope of concealment. Marcus straightened, his voice rising now, not just for Daniels but for every soul bearing witness. "Let's get one thing straight, this isn't just about me. This is about every single person who's ever been stopped, questioned, or humiliated for no reason other than daring to exist in a space folks like you think they don't belong in. I've got a law degree, a suit, and a voice that carries, but not everyone does. And I'm standing here to make damn sure people like you don't get to keep swinging that badge like a weapon." The crowd's cheers grew louder, a wave of support crashing over Marcus, buoying him up. Daniels's eyes darted from one phone to another, then back to Marcus, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty shadowed his face. Marcus tilted his head, studying the officer with the keen eye of a strategist sizing up an opponent on the verge of defeat. "You wanted a suspect, officer? Take a good, long look in the mirror. Because the only crime happening here is the one you're committing, trying to flex your authority to intimidate me. Spoiler alert, it's not going to work. Not today." Daniels's lips parted, a retort forming, but the words died in his throat. His mind churned visibly, racing to reclaim the upper hand as the crowd's energy shifted against him. Then, a voice pierced the clamor, a bystander, bold and curious. "Hey, isn't that Officer Daniels? The one from the news?" Daniels's head whipped toward the sound, his expression twisting into something akin to panic. Marcus seized the opening, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Oh, you're famous now? You didn't mention you already had a reputation. Let me guess, was it for heroism or something a little less noble?" The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of realization spreading like wildfire. Phones lit up as people tapped away, pulling up articles, piecing together whispers of Daniels's past. "Isn't he the guy who got suspended last year for excessive force?" someone called out. "Yeah," another chimed in, "I remember that, he got off with barely a slap on the wrist." Daniels's head snapped toward each voice, his composure splintering with every accusation. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore, they were judging, their phones transforming into gavels, their words into verdicts. Marcus stepped back, giving Daniels room to stew in the consequences of his own actions. Looks like your reputation's doing the talking for you, officer, he said. His tone cool and cutting. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The very system you've been twisting to your advantage is finally turning the tables. Justice has a funny way of catching up when you least expect it. Daniels glared, his lips curling into a sneer. Don't think this makes you special, he spat, venom lacing his low growl. Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off mid-rant. Careful now, officer. You're already neck-deep in this mess, don't dig yourself any deeper. The crowd burst into laughter and applause. Their confidence surging as Daniels's authority withered before their eyes. His hand hovered over his baton again, not out of strength but sheer frustration. He scanned the faces around him, searching for a lifeline, an ally, but there was none. Even his partner, a lanky figure who'd lingered on the sidelines, hesitated to step in. The man's eyes darted nervously between Daniels and the crowd, his reluctance palpable. He wasn't about to sink with this ship. Marcus closed the gap once more, his voice dropping to a near whisper that still carried weight. Let me break this down for you, officer. You've got two paths ahead. You can keep pushing, make a spectacle of yourself, and land in a courtroom where I'll tear your credibility to shreds, piece by pitiful piece. Or, he paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, you can walk away right now. No harm. No foul, well, except for that bruised pride of yours. But trust me, that's a small price to pay compared to the reckoning waiting if you don't. Daniels's jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack, his eyes flicking from the crowd to Marcus and back again. The pressure bore down on him, squeezing out every last drop of bravado until only raw vulnerability remained. You don't get to decide how this ends, he snarled, but the words lacked bite. A desperate grasp at control slipping through his fingers. Oh, but I do, Marcus replied, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as steel. The second you stepped into this mess, you handed me the reins. And believe me, I know exactly how to steer. The crowd roared, some shouting approval, others calling for Daniels to back off. His partner finally moved, stepping forward to place a tentative hand on Daniels's shoulder. Let it go, the man murmured, his voice low but firm, a quiet plea to salvage what little dignity remained. Daniels shot him a withering glare, but even he couldn't ignore the tide turning against him. The phones, the whispers, the articles surfacing, it was an avalanche he couldn't outrun. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he might double down, his pride clawing for one last stand. But then he met Marcus's gaze, steady, unflinching, a wall of resolve, and the fight drained from him. Without a word, Daniel spun on his heel, his boots scuffing the pavement as he stormed off, his partner trailing close behind. The crowd exploded into cheers, their applause thundering down the street as the officers retreated into the distance, shrinking with every step. Marcus remained rooted in place, watching them go. He didn't smile or revel in the victory, his exhale was slow, deliberate, the tension seeping from his shoulders like water from a cracked dam. But he wasn't finished. Turning to the crowd, he raised his hands, quieting their fervor. Thank you for standing here today, he said, his voice firm yet warm, a beacon in the chaos. But this isn't just about me, it's about all of us. Keep your phones out, keep recording, keep holding people like him accountable. Change doesn't come from staying quiet. The crowd's energy shifted, a unified force of purpose and power. Marcus nodded, adjusted his suit with a practiced flick, and picked up his briefcase. He had a case to argue, a bigger fight ahead, and he wouldn't let a power-drunk cop or a fleeting skirmish derail him. As he walked away, the lesson hung heavy in the air. Justice isn't just a word, it's a force, forged in the crucible of consequence, and when power is abused, the scales will tip. Daniels had learned that the hard way, and Marcus was determined to ensure the world wouldn't forget it. The air thickened with tension as Officer Daniels melted into the sea of faces, his retreating figure swallowed by the restless crowd. What had begun as a typical day on these bustling streets morphed into something electric, something alive. The people lining the pavement were no longer mere bystanders. Their eyes wide with curiosity or boredom, they had transformed into something more, a collective force bound by a shared sense of defiance. Phones remained aloft, capturing every fleeting second. Their soft clicks and flashes punctuating the air like a chorus of determination. Whispers rippled through the throng, no longer hushed with fear but brimming with awe and a quiet, resolute purpose. At the heart of it all stood Marcus, a pillar of unshakable calm amid the storm. His tailored suit clung to him with pristine elegance, untouched by the sweat and chaos of the moment. As if the heat of confrontation could never dare to tarnish his composure. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and deliberate, taking in the shifting tide of emotion around him. He wasn't finished, not yet. With a subtle turn, he fixed his gaze on a young man near the edge of the gathering, a wiry figure clutching his phone with trembling excitement. The faint glow of a live stream illuminating his face. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the din with a steady authority that demanded attention without force. "Could I take a look at that footage?" The young man's eyes widened, a grin tugging at his lips as he thrust the device forward, eager to oblige. Marcus cradled the phone gently, his fingers tracing its edges as he watched the video unfold. The screen replayed every detail, Daniel swaggering toward him with that smug certainty, his tone dripping with hostility. The ugly undertow of prejudice lacing his words like venom. Marcus's jaw tightened ever so slightly, a flicker of indignation buried beneath his cool exterior. Satisfied? He returned the phone with a curt nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening but firm. "Keep that online. The truth needs to breathe, needs to be seen." The young man beamed, his chest puffing with pride. "It's already taking off, sir. You're everywhere, going viral." Marcus allowed a faint smirk to curve his lips, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "Good," he replied, adjusting his tie with a deft flick of his wrist. "Let it spread." He pivoted to face the crowd fully, his presence commanding their silence as if he'd flipped a switch. The noise dulled to a murmur. Every gaze locking onto him, hanging on the promise of his next words. "What you saw today," he began, his voice rising just enough to pierce the clamor, "wasn't some random flare-up. It's woven into the fabric of a system, a machine that runs on fear, on silence, on the arrogant belief that no one will dare to push back." The crowd stilled, their breaths held. Their phones still recording as if preserving a sermon. Marcus's tone hardened, each syllable a blade honed by conviction. "But here's the reality, we don't have to bow to it. We don't have to choke on our own silence. Every lens, every voice, every soul standing here today proves we can rise, we can speak, and when we do, that system trembles. It has no choice but to bend." A wave of applause crashed over him, raw and unscripted, and Marcus dipped his head in quiet gratitude. He hefted his briefcase, its leather gleaming under the sun, and offered a parting promise. "If you'll excuse me, I've got a courtroom waiting. But mark this isn't the end, not for him, not for anyone who thinks power is a free pass to trample over others." With that, he turned and strode toward the courthouse, the crowd parting like water before him. Their voices trailed in his wake, a swell of gratitude and fire. "Thank you for standing tall. You're a damn hero. Make that cop pay." Marcus tossed a small wave over his shoulder, his steps unbroken, his focus unyielding. There was work to be done. Minutes later, he crossed the threshold of the courthouse. The cool marble lobby swallowing the heat of the street. His head remained high, his posture a silent declaration of purpose. The case awaiting him was no small matter, an employer accused of weaving discrimination into the bones of their operation, a fight Marcus had been chiseling away at for months. But after the morning's clash, a fresh clarity sharpened his mind, a fire stoked by the encounter with Daniels. He checked in with the court clerk. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes who offered him a flicker of a smile, sensing the weight he carried. Settling into a worn leather chair in the waiting area, Marcus let his thoughts drift back to the street. He replayed every moment, not with regret, but with a quiet pride. He hadn't lashed out with fists or fury, he'd wielded something stronger, intellect. Dignity, truth. In doing so, he hadn't just shielded himself, he'd lit a spark in those who'd watched, showing them the fractures in a system they'd long accepted as unbreakable. His phone buzzed against his thigh, a persistent hum pulling him from his reverie. He slid it from his pocket, the screen alight with a flood of notifications, texts from colleagues, emails from allies, social media tags spiraling into the thousands. The young man's video had erupted, its reach sprawling across platforms like wildfire. Comments scrolled past his eyes. "This is what real strength looks like. That cop's done, fire him. Marcus Wright, you've got my vote, my respect, my everything." A brief smile tugged at his lips, warm but fleeting. The praise felt good, like a breeze on a stifling day, but it wasn't the point. Justice was the point, the kind that didn't bend, didn't break, didn't settle for half measures. That fight was still miles from its finish line. When his name echoed through the lobby, Marcus rose, smoothing his suit as he stepped into the courtroom. The space hummed with anticipation. A low buzz of voices swelling as he entered. Heads turned, whispers trailing him like shadows. His reputation as a civil rights titan preceded him, and today's case, a landmark lawsuit, had already drawn the press like moths to a flame. He set his briefcase on the table with a soft thud, his movements deliberate, and glanced at his phone as it buzzed once more. A message from a reporter at a national outlet flashed across the screen. "Mr. Wright, the video of Officer Daniels is everywhere. The public's clamoring for accountability. Can we feature you in a story on systemic failures in law enforcement?" Marcus's lips twitched with a faint, knowing smile. He didn't reply, not yet. The courtroom demanded his focus first. The judge swept in, robes billowing, and the room stood in unison. Marcus moved through the proceedings like a maestro, his arguments precise, his evidence a battering ram against the opposition's flimsy defenses. He unraveled patterns of discrimination with surgical clarity, his voice steady yet resonant, each word landing like a stone in still water. By the time he delivered his closing argument, a searing, eloquent call for justice, even the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably, their confidence visibly fraying. When the gavel fell and the session adjourned, Marcus stepped into the hallway to find a small knot of supporters waiting. Some had been in the crowd that morning, their faces still alight with the day's fire. Others were longtime followers of his work, drawn by years of his quiet relentlessness. An older woman approached, her hands trembling as she clasped his. Her eyes, framed by deep lines of a life hard-lived, shimmered with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with a gratitude that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "For fighting for us." Marcus enveloped her hand in his grip firm yet tender. "It's not just my fight," he said softly. "It's ours. Thank you for standing with me." Before he could say more, a courthouse security guard edged closer, a stocky man with a hesitant frown. "Mr. Wright," he said, voice low, "there's a visitor outside." "A reporter. Said it's about this morning." Marcus nodded, gathering his briefcase and heading for the exit. The midday sun greeted him as he stepped onto the courthouse steps, its glare softened by a swelling crowd, journalists with microphones poised, onlookers craning for a glimpse. The video of Daniels had ignited a frenzy, and now Marcus stood at its epicenter, a figure thrust into a narrative far grander than he'd planned. A reporter lunged forward, her microphone trembling slightly in her grip. "Mr. Wright, can you comment on your run-in with Officer Daniels? Are you pursuing legal action?" Marcus paused, letting the question settle, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. Then he spoke, his voice clear and unwavering, each word a brick in a foundation he'd long been building. "What happened this morning wasn't a fluke," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "It's a thread in a tapestry too many of us have lived under for too long, woven from arrogance, from unchecked power. But today, something shifted. Today, we held a mirror to it, captured it raw and unfiltered. Accountability isn't just about one man in a uniform, it's about tearing down the scaffolding that props up this kind of behavior." The crowd stirred, a murmur of agreement rippling through them. Cameras flashing like lightning. As for Daniels, Marcus went on, his eyes narrowing slightly, "I'm not here to chase revenge. That's a hollow game. What I will do, what I'll always do, is shine a light on every corner where power festers and abuses thrive. Justice isn't a vendetta, it's a reckoning." Questions flew at him like arrows. But Marcus raised a hand, his gesture calm yet final. "You'll get more soon," he said. "For now, let this sink in, change doesn't bloom in the quiet. Today, we roared a little. Let's keep it going." He turned and walked away, his stride sure, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. Behind him, the crowd buzzed with a restless energy, their voices rising as the story spiraled further into the world. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his office, the city's skyline glittering beyond his window like a constellation of possibilities. His phone buzzed again, a news alert lighting the screen: Officer Daniels under investigation after viral clash with prominent civil rights attorney. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow, heavy breath. This wasn't a triumph to savor, not yet. It was a step, a fissure in a wall that had loomed over too many for too long. Closing his eyes, he thought of the crowd, their cheers, their lenses, their unshakable solidarity. This wasn't his burden alone, it was theirs, a shared mantle they'd all taken up. The lesson lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from on high, it was a fire stoked by those brave enough to demand it. And the consequences of power unchecked? They were a tide turning. A weight that men like Daniels would soon feel crashing down. Marcus opened his laptop, fingers poised over the keys, and began drafting his next move, a broader, bolder push for reform. The real work, he knew, was just beginning. And Marcus Wright, with his quiet fury and unyielding heart, was ready for it all.